G'day, mate. 40 here. So, since the racial reckoning kicked off by the death of George Floyd, May 25, 2020, America's experienced about 50,000 extra deaths. So, we've had about 20,000 extra homicides, about 20,000 extra driving deaths, and about 10,000 extra pedestrian deaths. You'd think in a sane and normal nation, this would be the #1 news story. But it's not. It's hardly talked about. And when you, say, put it into YouTube, racial reckoning leads to increased murders and deaths, right? You don't get any stories about how the racial reckoning has led police to follow the incentives to do less policing. And when the police do less policing, you get more reckless behavior, deaths of exuberance, more driving deaths. As a result, more pedestrian deaths when people drive more carelessly. And when the police do less stop and frisk, and they do less enforcement, then many people feel more entitled to walk around carrying a gun. And so you put into YouTube, right, racial reckoning leads to increased murders and deaths, and you don't get any relative information, all right? They're just trying to brainwash you. Nothing about how we've had this massive increase in murder and traffic fatalities as a result of the racial reckoning. But instead, we have all these stories about how the racial reckoning hasn't gone far enough, that we haven't changed enough. 2 years later, black leaders say racial reckoning didn't go far enough after George Floyd's death. Right? We've had 50,000 extra deaths since George Floyd's death. But you put this into Google now, and you still don't get any information about the massive increase in unnecessary deaths that we've had since George Floyd's death. All right, George Floyd's murder led to a national reckoning on race. How the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, how that leads to a racial reckoning. A racial reckoning, Fordham Law. Look back at year-long racial reckoning since George Floyd. Now, the elite stopped talking about the racial reckoning, and the primary news journalists also got the message not to talk about the racial reckoning because the racial reckoning almost cost Joe Biden the 2020 election. 2 years after Floyd's murder, racial trauma permeates U.S. But this is an article about the massive increase in the death toll due to our elites deciding that we've got way too much policing, and police need to return to the donut shop, and they need to stop pulling people over for driving recklessly. Right, racial reckoning, prosecuting America's civil rights. George Floyd's death ignited a racial reckoning. 1 year after George Floyd's murder, the racial reckoning gave way to a backlash. Yeah, why do you think it gave way to a backlash? Because of the massive increase in the number of unnecessary deaths that we've had as a result of this racial reckoning. And the person who's done more to talk about this issue than anyone is Steve Saylor, who was on a podcast called Filthy Armenian Adventures.
Things have a way of slowing down in L.A. Out here on the north side of Mulholland Drive, there's all kinds of reality, and it often moves very slow. Slow enough that you can notice things that don't necessarily make their way into the official illusion. This is the land of the men with gold chains, ground zero of studio porn, home of Bret Easton Ellis and Paul Thomas Anderson. This is where Ayn Rand spent 7 years writing The Fountainhead. Several industries of illusion have been planted here, private gated illusions cultivated all the time, but you can't really grow up here without an awareness of how much reality it takes to produce a solid illusion. How much engineering. After all, the valley became the valley, the mega suburbia that on its own makes up the 9th largest city in America, thanks to a workforce of engineers, funded by the great historical illusion known as the Cold War. One of those engineers is the father of Steve Saylor, my guest today, who grew up on this side of Mulholland Drive. And the reason I'm spending so much verbal watercolor on the valley and the reality, schmeality, and illusion, schmillusion, is that I think the worldly suburban Steve Saylor could have come from nowhere else in the world. He is one of the true figures in this landscape, where no suburb is free of city or city free of suburb. Never mind Chinatown's Jake Giddies or Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. The real Marlowe isn't being hired to follow rich dames around and marvel at gams and plug thugs in rainy alleys. The real Marlowe is writing for oons.com. The real honest dick trying to walk straight in a crooked world is writing for VDare and Taki's Mag. The real private eye is an ostracized public pundit, quantifying how many more people die every time there's a racial reckoning, predicting the next trans psyop, wondering why it's so hard to find a white cornerback, examining the art of golf courses or the secret admirable motives of a celebrated bullshit artist like Edward Said, not just what he Said. The real Marlowe has a theory on mass shootings and female journalists. The real Marlowe has masculine hobbies such as sports, which he isn't afraid to consult for clues into human nature versus nurture. The real Marlowe reads books, watches movies, and has a range of amateur interests. His curiosity is as inexhaustible as his ambitions are moderate. The real Marlowe dabbled successfully.
So you wouldn't guess that the name of this man's podcast is Filthy Armenian Adventures. Bills itself as an immersive existential travel mystery show, recorded in the flesh at glittering locations with enchantingly filthy characters all over Los Angeles.
Fully in business, but found it spiritually boring and chose to devote his full time to investigating cases of a social and political nature, the kind where the official story is almost always corrupt. Like the fictional Marlowe, the real Marlowe often finds himself digging too deep for even his own clients' comfort. When the real Marlowe tells the General Sternwoods of his world that their plan to invade the Middle East with democracy is culturally doomed due to Arabs, the real Marlowe is blackballed as a racist by his own side and no longer published in the National Review, where his writing once appeared alongside that great Southern misanthrope, Florence King. No big book deals or Fox shows or Vox Media Empire gigs for the real Philip Marlowe. But the real Marlowe never gets bitter. He takes his isolation in stride, as the cronies of conventional opinion make their discourse scenes in D.C. and New York and get rich. The intrepid Marlowe hangs in there, doing his own thing in the valley, under the sun where nothing is new, and keeps on noticing. Because unlike the fictional moody bachelor Marlowe, the real Marlowe is a dad. And no matter how unpopular dads may get for a decade or two, the time will always come when everybody wants dad to come home. The time will come when Dad, Elon Musk, buys Twitter, restores the freedom to speak reality, and the real Philip Marlowe's following explodes. The time will come when a group of Anon dads will start a publishing house called Passage Press, which brings out a handsome collection of the real Marlowe's most prescient writings called Noticing, which you all should buy a copy of now at www.passage.press. The time will come when Mama Anna Hatyan starts liberally quoting Steve Saylor on the Red Scare podcast for all the artistic-minded girls and gays to take heed, and suddenly the real Marlowe finds himself becoming a cowboy father figure to the most culturally vibrant scene in New York. The time will come, and the time has come, for the real Marlowe, for Steve Saylor. This is the year that dads are stepping up to save civilization, and Steve Saylor was a trusty, approachable, kind, gently mischievous, endlessly interested, polymathic Western voice in that cognitive, paternal elite. We met at the Yellow House across the Weddington Golf Course, where Vice Cop Jeff Daniels loses his temper in the 1996 movie 2 Days in the Valley.
God damn it. I've had it with you assholes. That is the third time you've broken my fucking window!
Whoa! Whoa!
Get out from behind that tree.
Whoa!
Come out with your hands up. I'm a police officer.
It wasn't me, all right? It was him.
Walk
He did
out.
it. Hey, where you going?
Walk out.
Okay, I'm coming. Coming. Don't shoot.
And the first thing I noticed was how impressively light my fellow Angelino is on his feet.
Wait, is he saying that heterosexual Steve Saylor is light in his loafers? I must take exception to that kind of slur. All right, I think a good analogy for what's going on in the West Bank is what's going on California's coast. All right?
Mother Nature, you don't use your real brain, you start to do that colonizer mindset. This is all invasive Tasmanian blue gum eucalyptus planted by Jack London. He planted.
All right, so we've got invasive species here on
thinking you could secure a
California
bag,
coast.
cut them all and turn them into lumber. Sadly, but what happens when you try to secure a bag off of Mother Nature, you don't use your real brain, you start to do that colonizer mindset. This is all invasive Tasmanian blue gum eucalyptus planted by Jack London. He planted them thinking he could secure a bag, cut them all and turn them into lumber. Sadly, they can't be turned into lumber, only into paper, so he gets a massive L, and now they took over. It's also a classic reminder that Mother Nature has a sense of humor. Planted all this invasive eucalyptus to try to make money, and it ended up burning his house down, bro. Look at all the bark. This is filled with eucalyptus oil. Same with the leaves. This shit burns like gasoline, dude, and the trees will explode. Yes, the mushrooms are eating the eucalyptus. Massive W. I did not know they did that. Eucalyptus trees are only here because of humans, so it is our job to remove this mess that we created. These trees are highly flammable and thought to be a cash crop, but it completely failed, and now they've taken over, and they're falling, and they're burning, bro. Invasive bullshit for days. Eucalyptus was only planted here because humans had already destroyed the old-growth redwood ecosystem. They wanted a fast-growing tree to secure that bag off Mother Nature. It should look like this. This is an intact ecosystem where wildlife would thrive, and humans could have thrived like the Native Americans did, but they decided to cut it down. This is that real shit. It wouldn't have burned his house down because, as you can see, they're fire-resistant and they're beef. These trees do work, and we need to protect the few that are left. 99% are gone here.
Yeah, but the disturbing part is how are they protecting them? Right, they're protecting them by practicing discrimination and speciesism. They're trying to discriminate against this species. Like, no species is illegal, bro. Right? All species are equally deserving of our dignity and of our protection. I don't think we should be speciesist and, carry on some war of genocide against the eucalypti. Yeah, eucalypti emit chemicals that don't allow other forms of vegetation to live underneath them. Yeah, eucalypti tend to outcompete native vegetation for water resources. Okay, yeah, eucalypti tend to be very oily and particularly go up in flames, all right, when they catch a light. But I don't think that's any excuse to practice speciesism. Right? Eucalypti just want to live in peace. The eucalypti fundamentally are trees of peace. All right, what's going on the West Bank?
What's happening in the West Bank is a total separation of two sets of law, one for Jews, one for the local Palestinians. Since October 7, there are clear campaigns of settlers to force villagers out of their homes permanently, and the military and the police doing nothing. One day, a group of settlers were meeting with some of the local Palestinians when one of them shot a Palestinian in the stomach. And we went to the village and we interviewed him. We know that the police only detained the settler who shot him for 20 minutes. And this is just one case study among many, many others that describe a total failure in the law enforcement on settlers and ultra-right. What is unique in the story we are publishing in the magazine,
New York Times.
it's almost in its entirety coming from Israeli officials. So the professionals, officials in the defense establishment and the intelligence community are aligning against the police and against the minister in charge of the police, the ultra-nationalist Itamar Ben-Gvir. Thanks to that, we also have much deeper access into top secret memos, where it says explicitly the police has stopped enforcing the law on Jewish ultranationalists, where it says explicitly the police refuses to come to scenes where Palestinians are filing complaints. And of course, you cannot sustain a long time lawless control over ultranationalist settlers just 20 minutes from where I sit here in North Tel Aviv, without this infiltrating, proliferating into Israel and endangering the whole of Israel as a democracy that has a strict enforcement of the law on everybody.
So New York Times has a long piece here.
Birth of a movement. With its overwhelming victory in the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, Israel more than doubled the amount of land it controlled, seizing new territory in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. Now it faced a choice. Would the new land become
This is a map of all gun
Israel?
homicides in the U.S. from 2020 until the end of 2023. We made this.
Stop this. Okay, so Israel had to fight for its survival repeatedly after being invaded by multiple Arab nations. And in 1967, with 5 Arab nations poised to invade it, Israel fought back and Israel won. And as a result of its surprising victory, right, they took over the land that is now known normally in the news media as the West Bank, known in traditional Jewish languages, Judea and Samaria, or part of Greater Israel, right? Not part of the current state of Israel, but occupied territory, right? Occupied by Israel since the 1967 invasion. So if Arab nations invade Israel and Israel fights back and defeats them and takes over territory that comes about as a result of the Arab nations trying to wipe out Israel, right? Now Israel saddled with territory and millions of Palestinians who hate it.
Be bargained away as part of a future Palestinian state. To a cadre of young Israelis imbued with messianic zeal, the answer was obvious. The acquisition of the territories animated a religious political movement, Gush Emunim, or Bloc of the Faithful, that was determined to settle the newly conquered lands. Gush Emunim followers believed that the coming of the Messiah would be hastened if, rather than studying holy books from morning to night, Jews settled the newly occupied territories. This was the land of Greater Israel, they believed, and there was a pioneer spirit among the early settlers. They saw themselves as direct descendants of the earliest Zionists who built farms and kibbutzim near Palestinian villages during the first part of the 20th century, when the land was under British control. But while the Zionism of the earlier period was largely secular and socialist, the new settlers believed they were advancing God's agenda. The legality of that agenda was an open question.
Now, how do you know what the settlers believed? So much of the news takes what people say at face value, and you just can't take what people say at face value. So religious explanations are usually considered more honorable than purely ethnic and racial explanations, but that doesn't mean that's what's primarily driving the conflict. The conflict in Ireland, for example, is discussed as Catholic versus Protestant, but that's not, disagreements over religion is not what's primarily driving this conflict. It's primarily an ethnic conflict where the most polite manifestation of this ethnic racial conflict is the religious clothing, but it's not the religious idiosyncrasies between Protestantism and Catholicism that's driving the Irish conflict, right? It's a battle between distinct peoples, right? Most battles are ethnic battles. They're battles between different races.
The Geneva Conventions, to which Israel was a signatory, forbade occupying powers to deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. But the status of the territory was, in the view of many within and outside the Israeli government, more complex. The settlers saw.
So in 25 years, the West Bank settlers haven't murdered more than a couple of dozen Palestinians in the West Bank. So compared to the massive death toll going on in Gaza right now of approximately 35,000, or just in the United States, the death toll of the racial reckoning, the Black Lives Matter agitation that's led to an extra 50,000 deaths, right? There's a trivial number of deaths in the West Bank. So it garners attention because it's Israel doing it, and Israel is the dominant power, right? Israel is the one industrial advanced nation in a sea of underperforming powers. So I'm not an expert on the modern Islamic world, but when I look at Islamic states, I can't see anything in this civilization that I admire. Historically, yes, there are many things about Islamic civilization to admire. But right now, when I look at Saudi Arabia or Iran, look at Egypt or Jordan or Turkey, I can't think of any reason why I would want my civilization to be more like theirs. On the other hand, with almost every other civilization, I can find many things to admire. I can find many things to admire about Aboriginal civilization, their superior abilities to survive in harsh terrain, their superior tracking abilities, their superior improvisational abilities, right? There are many things about Aboriginal culture that I admire, about Japanese culture, Central and South American culture. I can find many things to admire, not to mention, say, the various Scandinavian countries, Korea, China, Thailand, Taiwan. I mean, almost every culture I can find many things to admire. But currently, about the least advanced part of the world seems to be those countries that are dominantly Islamic. And by contrast with the low achievement levels of these dominantly Islamic Arab nations, right, Israel has developed in the past 80 years to be a highly advanced country with many technological, entrepreneurial, scientific, medical advances, with a great amount of publishing, with many contributions into the world of scholarship, technology, entrepreneurship, and it makes the surrounding Arab Islamic nations look quite puny by comparison.
To create what some of them called facts on the ground. This put them into conflict with both the Palestinians and, at least putatively, the Israeli authorities responsible for preventing the spread of illegal settlements. Whether or not the government would prove flexible on these matters became clear in April 1975 at Ain Yabrud, an abandoned Jordanian military base near Ofra in the West Bank. A group of workers had been making the short commute from Israel most days for months to work on rebuilding the base, and one evening they decided to stay. They were aiming to establish a Jewish foothold in Judea and Samaria, the Israeli designation for the territories that make up the West Bank, and they had found a back door that required only the slightest push. Their leader met that same night with Shimon Peres, then Israel's defense minister, who told the IDF to stand down. Peres would treat the nascent settlement not as a community, but as a work camp, and the IDF would do nothing to hinder their work. Peres's maneuver was partly a sign of the weakness of Israel's ruling Labor Party, which had dominated Israeli politics since the country's founding.
So every type of life tries to create an environment around it which is most conducive to its thriving. And I'm thinking of this Arab-Israeli conflict in the West Bank is very similar to conflicts over gentrification. For example, large parts of Los Angeles, which are dominated by African Americans, if there wasn't an extraordinary crime rate in those neighborhoods, right, other groups would move in and take over those neighborhoods because they are prime real estate. They're near downtown Los Angeles, and they get to enjoy the beautiful weather of Southern California. But because African Americans completely understandably want to maintain their neighborhoods, right, one of the most effective ways of maintaining their neighborhoods is to have a high crime rate and to threaten outsiders. Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, near downtown Los Angeles, is dominantly Latino district, and it agitates against gentrification, right? Any signs of gentrification meets with very stern resistance. So all sorts of groups fight to maintain their territory. And in Los Angeles, we had a kosher cafe that set up in Boyle Heights, and it's now closed. But for years, it had to operate against, anti-gentrification protests.
Anger in the streets when a kosher cafe opens in Boyle Heights. Neighbors want it shut down. The LAPD kept protesters back as demonstrators shouted at people at the grand opening.
And they're not just angry over gentrification, it's the owner's views that also have them riled up. KCON9's Dave Lopez is live in Boyle Heights with details on the controversy. Dave?
Well, standing in front of this cafe, the man who owns this is an immigrant. He has a number of companies, very successful businessman. Of his 70 employees, he told me that nearly all of them are immigrants. He also said he supports Trump and his immigration policies, and because he posted that, well, that's where all the problems started.
So what's the
No, that's not where all the problems started. The problem started because this is a Jewish cafe in a Latino neighborhood. Now, it used to be a Jewish neighborhood, right? No people emerged out of the ground, right? Everyone moved from somewhere and took over a piece of territory. So even if this cafe owner hadn't talked about his support of Trump immigration policies, there still would have been these anti-gentrification protests because people want to maintain their hold, their dominance over particular parts of territory.
connection? This is what I don't understand. I'm confused. The connection between Donald Trump and a good coffee.
30 years ago, Asher Shalom immigrated from his native Israel to the United States. He told me he cried like a baby when he became a U.S. citizen. And
So in the end, these protests won. Right, this cafe is closed down.
he also said he supports Donald Trump and his immigration policies. And he can't understand why that's so wrong.
Everything changed in one day.
He was all set for a grand opening of his new kosher cafe in Boyle Heights, not far from downtown Los Angeles. The Boyle Heights Chamber of Commerce.
Now, the only reason this cafe lasted for several years was because it got the help of the Jewish community, right? The Jewish community rallied around, patronized this cafe.
Commerce had invited him to be a member. They were going to be there to help celebrate. Then he got this email.
So similarly, Jews often lead gentrification in Los Angeles. It's not just gays, but it's often Israelis, particularly former members of the Israeli Defense Force. They're willing to go into these dominantly Latino and African-American neighborhoods to buy property and then to defend their property. Then after them come other Israelis and other people who are sturdy enough to move into a new territory and to face up to the resistance from that community's African-American and Latino population.
Email from the chamber president, Jennifer Lahuda, saying that because he posted this on his Facebook page, they called it an anti-immigrant posting, he could no longer be a member of the chamber. They weren't going to show up at the grand opening. And then a group known as Defend Boyle Heights started posting on their social media what was happening, and they called for a boycott, a big boycott.
So now we have a full lineup.
So there's no inherent reason why any side in this protest is correct, right? It just depends on your particular hero system, right? How could you, from a nationalist perspective, how could you not have some respect for people who are trying to defend their territory?
Police here at Asher Cafe.
It was very scary. There was a lot of people protesting outside, wearing masks.
They really intensely protested and accosted all the visitors that came to our grand opening event.
And they threw a significant amount of feces at our windows.
Shalom says all because he...
So higher IQ groups are less likely to throw feces. So the pro-Palestine protests are engaged in a lot of like low IQ chanting, low IQ protests. They've been disciplined to the extent they're able to get most of their members not to talk to the news media and reveal the low IQ nature of much of their protesting.
He expressed on social media his opinion about Trump and immigrants.
I don't think politics should get in the way of good food. I support him in that. I will come and give him my business.
This is part of what the chamber wrote to Shalom. Boyle Heights thrives because of our diverse immigrant population. The chamber will always celebrate and support this fact. We will not support anyone who chooses to conduct themselves in a hateful manner, especially towards members of our community.
Nothing true.
Shalom is a respected businessman who has been honored by both the city and the county for his generous works.
My last name is Shalom, and I love peace.
We reached out to both organizations, Defend Boyle Heights.
A suspect is caught on camera vandalizing a new coffee shop in Boyle Heights. Now, tonight, the owner believes that crime was a warning.
Yeah, many people in the area say new businesses are coming in and driving up the rent for everyone. KCAL 9's Danielle Gersh has details.
This coffee shop behind me is...
So when you talk about the rent going up, is because the quality of life in a neighborhood is improving, all right? You're reducing crime. You have more services available, all right? When Jews move into a neighborhood, all right, the rent tends to go up. When Northeast Asians, right, Chinese or Japanese or Koreans move into a neighborhood in the United States, right, the rent tends to go up because the quality of life, the quality of education goes up.
New to town here in Boyle Heights, and last night someone shattered the window of its front door. Some say the small coffee shop is a target of a much larger issue. Either way, now the owners are left to clean up the mess. Security camera video shows someone who appears to be dressed in black and wearing a mask walk up to this Boyle Heights coffee shop and aim what looks like a slingshot at the front door.
So when I arrived, I saw the glass shattered.
One of the owners of Weird Wave Coffee tells us some didn't offer the warmest welcome when his small coffee shop opened here over a month ago, protesting over a much larger anti-gentrification issue in the neighborhood. But still, he says he doesn't want to point fingers and has no idea who did this.
That's sad.
Stephen Martinez owns Lee's Key and Locksmith down the street. It's been around since the 1950s. And unlike some here, he's in favor of new businesses moving in. Others in the area feel newcomers are driving up rents and pushing out businesses and people who have lived here for years.
Everybody's afraid of change, and change is constant.
People we talk with tell us they came by the coffee shop today to get good coffee and simply say they want the coffee shop here.
Bashing and vandalizing and threatening is not going to stop progress.
And Jesse Lee Peterson.
A while back, I told you about a cafe in Boyle Heights, California. And the cafe was attacked during the opening, grand opening. And it was pure evil, folks, pure evil. And the reason that these people attacked this cafe was because of their support, the owner's support of President Trump, the Great White Hope. I want to play that soundbite for you just to remind you of this news report. This was back in July. And Joel, let's go. This is from KCAL, KCALS, right? I mean,
So Southern California is home to hundreds of thousands of Israelis. I think it's the prime location in the United States that Israelis like to come. About 500,000 Israelis have left Israel since the October 7 attack. I mean, if you live in Israel, right, you need to know where your bomb shelter is because you're likely to become threatened by rocket attacks from Hamas or Hezbollah or from Iran. And so in response to life in a hostile neighborhood, right, just like people opening up a kosher coffee house in a dominantly Latino neighborhood, right, West Bank settlers are trying to create a safe neighborhood for themselves and to drive out people who hate them. Right? If the October 7 attacks had occurred against West Bank settlers, they would not have been nearly as successful because West Bank settlers tend to be armed and to be ready to defend themselves. The October 7 attacks by Hamas were against the most, pro-Palestinian, the most liberal, the most seeking peace and accommodation with Palestinian segment of the Israeli population. Right? These attacks were against the left-wing socialist kibbutzim that weren't very well armed, that didn't take their own defense seriously, that would employ Palestinian labor who then would report back to Hamas or the location where they were working and how that location worked and what its security was like. They would, many of these members of these kibbutzes would transport sick Palestinians to Israeli hospitals for medical care. And as a result, they got slaughtered. So it was not an adaptive strategy. When you unilaterally disarm yourself and you assist your enemy who hates you and wants to kill you, and then you get slaughtered, all right, you're not going to have much reproductive success. On the other hand, West Bank settlers who have a much cold-hearted, attitude towards the Palestinians and the Arabs, right? Much more ready to defend themselves, ready to do battle, or organized and prepared, right? They are much harder to kill.
The residual trauma of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israel was caught completely by surprise by Egyptian and Syrian forces before eventually beating back the invading armies, had shaken citizens' belief in their leaders, and movements like Gush Emunim, directly challenging the authority of the Israeli state, had gained momentum amid labor's decline. This, in turn, energized Israel's political right. By the late 1970s, the settlers, bolstered in part by growing political support, were expanding in number. Carmi Gilon, who joined Shin Bet in 1972 and rose by the mid-1990s to become its director, recalls the evolving internal debates. Whose responsibility was it to deal with settlers? Should Israel's vaunted domestic security service enforce the law in the face of clearly illegal acts of settlement?
So all enforcement of the law takes place, right, with human beings who exercise subjective judgment. And so this subjectivity doesn't only occur on the West Bank, all right? Everywhere, police have to determine, and district attorneys have to determine, what are they going to prosecute. So looking at an interesting Twitter thread here, Daniel writes, I went to Cairo, Illinois, the capital of the fastest shrinking county in America. I wrote about why in the future much larger parts of America are likely to lose population. And Steve Saylor notes, America has a general problem in its heavily black places, such as Cairo, turning into ghost towns over the generations as first the whites leave, then the more enterprising blacks leave, leaving the dregs of society to shoot each other for amusement. So many of these heavily black cities tend to depopulate as the crime rate just spirals. So if a black-dominated municipality has a particularly attractive location like Compton, California, right, straight out of Compton, the home of gangster rap near LAX, and countless other jobs, the Hispanics will often take it off the blacks' hands after long, nasty fights. So Oakland has better weather than San Francisco, so it might be the most desirable urban location in the country, but a fear of gentrification is probably one motivation for Oakland's long history of black radical craziness and violence. So it's a normal, natural human inclination to want to defend your city. But I think the biggest problem in America right now is crime, driven in large part by the racial reckoning.
And bystanders, many of them children like that 5-year-old girl. Police say she was in a car around 3:30 in the morning Sunday on the city's near west side, where neighbors say there's been a lot of gang activity recently. The girl's dad was standing in a group outside when gunshots started flying. He was also shot and taken to the hospital, but is expected to survive. Folks in that neighborhood, though, are understandably shaken up.
There's been like a war zone.
It could be a lot better. They could patrol a little more.
Memorial Day weekend is often when we see violent crime start to pick up. And on Friday, Mayor Brandon Johnson laid out his summer safety plan to address the violence, which focuses less on policing and more on investing in the city's most violent neighborhoods with millions of dollars for community programs, jobs for teens, and
midnight basketball. All right, I think the best solution to this kind of violence is just more midnight basketball.
And neighborhood peacekeepers.
We are holistically investing in our people and communities to eradicate the root causes of crime, the root causes of harm, to create long-term peace.
The teen takeovers of Chicago's downtown area last summer are still fresh on a lot of folks' minds, and to prevent a repeat of those scenes, city leaders are asking parents to be more proactive and to know where their kids are this summer. And if things get out of hand, Chicago's top cop says police won't hesitate to take action.
But if you're showing up to wreak havoc on the city, to infringe upon other people's rights and their safety, we're going to stop you. And if that means that we have to arrest you, we're going to do it.
The Democratic National Convention in August, and that's going to put the spotlight, the national spotlight, on both the city and the mayor's progressive policies.
So Chicago's police, all right, they are also influenced by politics. And you see in America's bigger cities, all right, that are dominated by Democrats, the police and law enforcement and district attorneys, they tend to prefer to focus on likely Republican voters who like to own guns, but they don't focus on those Biden voters who own guns.
Actor was killed confronting alleged thieves in downtown Los Angeles early Saturday morning. 37-year-old Johnny Wachter, best known for his role on long-running soap opera General Hospital, was shot when he and a co-worker returned to his car at around 3:30 a.m. Police say a group of men were trying to take its catalytic converter. Thefts of the high-value car part have skyrocketed in California in recent years. His mother, Scarlett, gave this statement to Fox, and I'm quoting, "They were walking to their car, and when they get there, Johnny's car looked like it was hijacked or jacked to one side. And from what I understand, he said, 'Hey, man, you towing my car?' And the person looked up and had a mask. And so then I guess he knew they weren't doing that, and so he stepped in front of the coworker and then backed up and put his hands up, or both, and the person shot him." The three suspects fled the scene. They are still on the loose. Jason Rance, Seattle radio host, joins me now. A couple hours ago, we talked about the leftist.
So California has effectively voted to legalize theft up to about $950. It is only a misdemeanor in California. So when you encourage theft, right, by decreasing the penalties for theft, you encourage all sorts of violence that then is generated by theft. And so there we have the murder of a soap opera actor, right, that likely would not have taken place if the theft of catalytic converters wasn't so incentivized. I know one acquaintance has had his catalytic converter stolen 3 times in the past year. Virtually everyone I know in Los Angeles has had their car broken into over the past year. Right, back to this New York Times article on the West Bank.
When we realized that Gush Emunim had the backing of so many politicians, we knew we shouldn't touch them, he said in his first interview for this article in 2016. One leader of the ultra-right movement would prove hard to ignore, however. Meir Kahane, an ultra-right rabbi from Flatbush, Brooklyn, had founded the militant Jewish Defense League in 1968 in New York. He made no secret of his belief that violence was sometimes necessary to fulfill his dream of greater Israel, and he even spoke of plans to buy .22 caliber rifles for Jews to defend themselves.
So it's fairly normal in history that people fight over territory, all right? Nobody emerges out of the ground, right? Everybody's moved from somewhere else, and their people have taken over territory. I was just looking up the Comanches because, contrary to a lot of left-wing rhetoric, that North America was this peaceful, thriving utopia before the white man arrived, right? The Native American Indians were constantly slaughtering each other, and Comanche, that name means enemy, or literally anyone who wants to fight me all the time. That's the real literal meaning of the term Comanche, right? It comes from a rival tribe, and it literally means anyone who wants to fight me all the time. And also in nature, you see different types of plant life competing with each other for survival. So eucalypti tend to be more successful because they emit chemicals that destroy the ability of other plants to live underneath them, and they tend to outcompete other vegetation for water. So life is often a brutal struggle for survival. It's not just something that happens on the West Bank.
Our campaign motto will be "Every Jew a 22," he declared. In 1971, he received a suspended sentence on bomb-making charges, and at the age of 39, he moved to Israel to start a new life. From a hotel on Zion Square in Jerusalem, he started a school and a political party, what would become Kach, and drew followers with his fiery rhetoric. Kahane said he wanted to rewrite the stereotype of Jews as victims, and he argued in often vivid terms that Zionism and democracy are in fundamental tension.
Well, there's nothing inherently democratic or liberal about Zionism. Zionism just means nationalism. Nationalism can be authoritarian, it can be socialist, it can be democratic. Nationalism can, manifest in many different forms. Yeah, many tribes give give the name for their competitors, right? But I like that for Comanche, you know, that which will fight me all the time. Steve Saylor wrote, April 21, 2016, gentrification's battlefront in LA. Los Angeles, with its lovely climate, I mean, this is the best climate in the world, right? Offers the single largest gentrification opportunity of the 21st century. Boyle Heights is a former Jewish neighborhood just east of downtown Los Angeles. It was taken over by Mexicans about a century ago. You'd think this would be an obvious candidate for gentrification, but ethnic violence is often used to fight back against gentrifiers. Oakland retards gentrification via politicized black violence since the days of the Black Panthers. Now from The Guardian, hope everyone pukes on your artisanal treats, fighting gentrification LA style. Hardline tactics succeed in keeping outsiders away from Boyle Heights, the Latino community that is the last holdout to Los Angeles gentrification. So by being particularly nasty to anyone who's seeking to improve the neighborhood, right, they manage to hold on to it. Now, Southern California doesn't have a lot of organized left-wing muscle in the style of Oakland, but Boyle Heights was once Jewish, so it does have a certain appeal to romantic Marxists. Now, Southern California increasingly has affluent, hard-nosed, 100% white, guilt-free immigrants from Armenia, Israel, Vietnam, Iran, Russia, Korea, Uzbek, Chinese, from China, the Arabs, who don't see much reason why they should take any guff from Mexicans, who definitely have the numbers in Southern California, but don't tend to have the money. So the real estate future of Southern California will be full of interest as these guilt-free immigrants see good land and move into it. Another Steve Saylor post from 2020, the end of gentrification. So side-by-side headlines in the U.S. version of the Daily Mail. You have murders in New York continue to surge. And then New York's mayor saying a new disciplinary database for New York cops will publicly list names and charges of 1,100 pending cases. So what happens to America's bluest cities when the establishment switches sides from the cops to the blacks? So in Israel, by and large, the establishment has sided with the settlers. They've switched sides from the Palestinians to the settlers. The Jewish state is siding with Jews in their struggle against Palestinians. So in America, our elites appear intent on trying this experiment once again, though we have a couple of highly relevant historical examples that they ought to recall first. So blacks make up 1/8 of America's population, but they've accounted for the majority of homicide offenders in recent decades. And how do you respond to that? If you say enforcement first, punishment first, right, that is highly effective at reducing crime rates, but it results in a lot of African Americans going to jail. So we've had about 20,000 extra murders since the racial reckoning set off by George Floyd's death. We've got about 20,000 extra driving deaths and about 10,000 extra pedestrian deaths, thanks to the incentives that the establishment has given our police in the United States to back off from law enforcement. So the Ferguson effect was named after the celebrated August 2014 riots. I'm reading from Steve Saylor's column here in June 2020, The End of Gentrification. It was repeatedly denied by the media until the evidence became overwhelming, at which point they stopped talking about it. Murders fell 7% from 2016 to 2018 under Donald Trump. But now murders have been growing dramatically since May of 2020, though that growth has appeared to decrease over the past year. So today, the news media portray those whites who flee as bad guys prey on them, that the whites are guilty of the racial felony of abandoning blacks and Puerto Ricans to the ravages of segregation. Now, in the past, media coverage was less hateful and bigoted, in part because journalists were often related to these former outer borough whites. But today, fewer and fewer dare speak up about what really happened to white residents of cities after the civil rights era unleashed liberalism on them and a massive increase in criminal violence, right? Prior to the passing of civil rights legislation in 1964-65, right, we had the highest national cohesion, social trust, and relatively low crime rates. And then after the passing of civil rights legislation, right, we had a massive increase in homicide. Right, homicide went up under New York's only black mayor, David Dinkins, to 2,245 in 1990. Right, in Rudy Giuliani's final year as mayor, homicides fell to 649. right? About 1/4 of the rate they were under David Dinkins. Right? Giuliani managed to get the New York Police Department to put in 4 hours of real work per shift. And then murders in New York City continued to decline under Michael Bloomberg, but now they've been heading up since 2020. So you'd think that this incredible 87% decline in the number of killings in New York City would be a great urban success story, contributed to an enormous increase in property values, right? Much of Manhattan and Brooklyn gentrified, but this created intense resentment against those who were less successful, and especially among blacks who felt entitled to live in the highest potential real estate in America. Now, it's polite to claim in public that whites unfairly wound up with all the magic real estate while blacks were forced to live in the tragic dirt conveniently close to downtown. Truth is that post-war black neighborhoods tended to be located desirably near jobs, near airports, near parks, and other amenities. But the enforcement of the rule of law would tend to imprison a lot of blacks. So there was a pushback against enforcement of the rule of law. Different communities, different groups tend to want different levels of law enforcement. So black communities have managed to hold on to a lot of valuable real estate in the United States through crime and through riot, which makes their neighborhoods less desirable. And whites decide to instead subject themselves to long commutes rather than try to gentrify black neighborhoods. Right? Blacks live on much of the best real estate in the United States, and they want to keep it by hook or by crook. And keeping up a high crime rate is one effective way to do this. So I respect people who want to maintain control of their neighborhoods. I understand why some blacks, when they see whites driving into a neighborhood to look to buy homes, would resent that. Like, oh no, because people understandably want to live in an environment most conducive to their own thriving. People like to be around people like themselves. So in many Jewish neighborhoods, like, Jews will only sell their homes to fellow Jews. So there's been a struggle to transfer the lowest achieving parts of the American population off valuable real estate. The Obama administration originated an elaborate effort by rich white real estate developers in Chicago, such as Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker, to find black front people such as Valerie Jarrett and Barack and Michelle Obama to allow the housing projects near downtown Chicago to be torn down. Problem for Democrats is that while their votes depend upon turning out blacks, right, the money that funds the Democratic Party depends in large part upon white property owners who don't benefit from crime and looting. Back to the West Bank.
Zionism came into being to create a Jewish state, Kahana said in an interview with The Times in 1985, 5 years before he was assassinated by a gunman in New York. Zionism declares that there is going to be a Jewish state with a majority of Jews, come what may. Democracy says no. If the Arabs are the majority, then they have the right to decide their own fate. So Zionism and democracy are at odds. I say clearly that I stand with Zionism. 4. A buried report. In 1977, the Likud party led a coalition that, for the first time in Israeli history, secured a right-wing majority in the country's parliament, the Knesset. The party was headed by Menachem Begin, a veteran of the Irgun, a paramilitary organization that carried out attacks against Arabs and British authorities in Mandatory Palestine, the British colonial entity that preceded the creation of Israel. Likud, Hebrew for the Alliance, was itself an amalgam of several political parties. Kach itself was still on the outside and would always remain so.
So much of politics boils down to whom, like who is doing what to whom, like whose side are you on? And so the establishment in the United States sided against the cops and on behalf of Black Lives Matter activists. And as a result, we've had this massive increase in crime. So in New York City, right, we had the WASP mayor, John Lindsay. He sided with black activists against the city's Irish police and Jewish school teachers back in the 1960s. As a result, New York City murders grew sharply from 390 in 1959 to 634 in 1965 to 1,691 in 1972 under liberal Republican Mayor John Lindsay. So when you give cops the incentive to not enforce the law, they slow down on the job, they retreat to the donuts shop. So by one estimate, New York Police Department cops got down to doing about 2 hours of policing per 8-hour shift. The less policing you can do, the less likely you are to violate anybody's civil rights. So Giuliani managed to get the cops to double the amount of time they spent policing to about 4 hours. So white residents fled many neighborhoods, right? The once tranquil Bronx, right? That back in the 1930s, there was a couplet, "The Bronx No Thonks" by Ogden Nash, complaining about the lack of excitement. While the Bronx saw reported burglaries increase by 1,600% between 1960 and 1969. As a result, the white population of the Bronx fell 50% between 1970 and 1980. So the media portray these whites who flee as crime takes over as terrible, that they are guilty of the racial felony of abandoning blacks and Puerto Ricans to the ravages of segregation. Back to the West Bank, where you see that law enforcement and the army has chosen sides and has sided increasingly over the past 2 decades with Jewish settlers as opposed to the Palestinian Arabs.
But its radical ideas and ambitions were moving closer to the mainstream. Likud's victory came 10 years after the war that brought Israel vast amounts of new land. But the issue of what to do with the occupied territories had yet to be resolved. As the new Prime Minister, Begin knew that addressing that question would mean addressing the settlements.
So what would happen if you had the rule of law on the West Bank? It would operate against the interests of the Jewish settlers, who are a tiny minority, but who feel largely free of legal restrictions, and so they tend to brutalize Palestinian settlers. In the United States, if you had more of rule of law in America's most valuable real estate, you'd have the lowest achieving people who would be disproportionately from various minority groups would be forced out of various neighborhoods. And so if you want to maintain them in their neighborhoods, then you have to give up enforcing law. So which way do you want to go? Like, whose interests are you most interested in serving?
Could there be a legal basis for taking the land? Something that would allow the settlements to expand with the full support of the state. It was Plia Albeck, then a largely unknown bureaucrat in the Israeli Justice Ministry, who found Begin's answer. Searching through the regulations of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled Palestine in the years preceding the British Mandate, she lit upon the Ottoman Land Code of 1858, a major effort at land reform.
So in the United States, we have one minority group that consistently commits murder for as long as we've been keeping statistics about murder. So going back to the 18th century, we have one minority group that commits murder at about 8 times the rate of the white population. So why is this? Is it because they feel so oppressed, or do they behave in a reckless way because they essentially believe that they are privileged, and they appear surprised when they find out that the law still applies to them too? So it's understandable why Jewish settlers in the West Bank would feel privileged by the Jewish state. You would expect a Jewish state to privilege Jewish settlers, and that's exactly what's happening. Also, in major cities that are ruled by the Democratic Party, blacks would understandably feel some privilege because blacks essentially have a stranglehold of power on the Democratic Party. So when their party is in power, they would understandably expect to be privileged.
Among other provisions, the law enabled the Sultan to seize any land that had not been cultivated by its owners for a number of years, and that was not within shouting distance of the last house in the village. It did little to address the provisions of the Geneva Convention, but it was, for her department.
Okay, let's run through the chat. These protesters, anti-gentrification protesters, will attack businesses until every store closes down, like in Baltimore. Then they will accuse white people of creating food deserts. The news media report on crime like it is the weather. Wow, wave of crime just hit Chicago, but better forecast expected for June. Listen to a drug user who was caught printing fake dollar bills yesterday. Bit unsporting of these minorities to not handle gentrification like the stoic white people handled their displacement decades earlier. Latinos aren't scared of moving into black neighborhoods. They push the blacks out of Compton. Who is sovereign in the West Bank and Gaza in reality? Well, Israel is the Jewish state. Has Israel made an official claim? They don't claim that they own the land, right? They understand that they are occupying the land that they took in a war. So is the West Bank and Gaza no man's land? No, Israel rules it, but the population is about 90% Palestinian. But the 10% Israeli Jewish settlers do feel privileged, and for good reason.
Precedent enough. Soon Albeck was riding in an army helicopter, mapping the West Bank and identifying plots of land that might meet the criteria of the Ottoman law. The Israeli state had replaced the Sultan, but the effect was the same. Albeck's creative legal interpretation led to the creation of more than 100 new Jewish settlements, which she referred to as my children. At the same time, Begin was quietly brokering a peace deal with President Anwar Sadat of Egypt in the United States at Camp David. The pact they eventually negotiated gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt and promised greater autonomy to Palestinians in the occupied territories in return for normalized relations with Israel. It would eventually win the two leaders a joint Nobel Peace Prize.
So these Jewish settlers of the West Bank are a lot like gentrifiers, right? They're moving into a neighborhood that is dominated by another ethnic group that hates them. So back in 2014, Steve Saylor wrote about white gentrification of South-Central Los Angeles. For years, I've been predicting that the most massive gentrification opportunity of the 21st century would be South-Central Los Angeles. Right, this is a gigantic area of flat land, superb season-tempered climate, excellent freeway connections to jobs and airports, and cheap land. The main problem is the current residents. That hipster whites have a plan to do something about that. And so you've got soaring home prices spur a resurgence near USC. The hot housing market and the rail line push young professionals into the West Adams, South Central area. Now, you see in the news media all these claims that the freeways segregate, right? The 10 freeways segregated South LA from the rest of the city, splitting West Adams in two. But freeways don't segregate places from other places. They connect them. Right? Sherman Oaks in the Valley, where Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Valley Girl were filmed, is split in four by the interchange of the Ventura 101 and the San Diego 405 freeways. Right? And you see articles claiming that lead in gasoline causes crime. How could these residents not riot because they had a freeway nearby? But maybe having the most traditionally jammed freeway interchange in the country in Sherman Oaks caused the Valley Girl accents, but really crime? So social media makes it easier to gentrify since you can coordinate with other people on your wavelength about precisely which neighborhood you will descend upon. Big problem with South Central is it's so big, 51 square miles just in LA City, about as big as the entire city of San Francisco. So gentrifiers can't just drive around and spot each other the way that we could in Chicago, where the potentially gentrifying neighborhoods were quite small. The gentrifiers need to link up with each other online and argue out where they are headed. Another problem is that South Central is flat, and flat land tends to give wealthier white people in Los Angeles the creeps. I had a political science teacher at college who said, if you're ever lost, walk uphill because sewage flows downhill. Right. Wealthy white people picture the mob coming for them waving torches. Flat land is more convenient to live on than the hills that ambitious Angelinos have clung to since the movie business got rolling. Fear of apocalyptic mob violence directed at them has been endemic in elite Southern California circles since Nathaniel West's 1939 novel, The Day of the Locust, about a moron from Iowa named Homer Simpson and other scary average Joes who riot at the end. So in that mental atmosphere, hills have always seemed the most defensible.
But Gush Emunim and other right-wing groups saw the Accords as a shocking reversal. From this well of anger sprang a new campaign of intimidation. Rabbi Moshe Levinger, one of the leaders of Gush Emunim and the founder of the settlement in the heart of Hebron, declared the movement's purposes on Israeli television. The Arabs, he said, must not be allowed to raise their heads. Leading this effort would be a militarized offshoot of.
And that's pretty similar to the philosophy that the Hindu majority use in India. So India's Muslim minority have long tended to be about the best behaved Muslims in the world, because they know the vicious, murderous riots that will occur if they create disruption. So if minorities feel privileged to flout the law, you'll have chaos. On the other hand, if they realize that there will be deadly consequences if they flout the conventional morality, they will tend to be much better behaved.
Ushamunim called the Jewish underground. The first taste of what was to come arrived on June 2nd, 1980. Car bombs exploded as part of a complex assassination plot against prominent Palestinian political figures in the West Bank. The attack blew the legs off Bassam Shaka, the mayor of Nablus. Karim Khalaf, the mayor of Ramallah, was forced to have his foot amputated. Kahana, who in the days before the attack said at a news conference that the Israeli government should form a Jewish terrorist group that would throw bombs and grenades to kill Arabs, applauded the attacks, as did Rabbi Chaim Drukman, a leader of Gush Emunim then serving in the Knesset, and many others within and outside the movement. Brigadier General Binyamin Ben Eliezer, then the top IDF commander in the West Bank, noting the injuries suffered by the Palestinian mayors under his watch, said simply, "It's a shame they didn't hit them a bit higher." An investigation began, but it would be years before it achieved any results. Ben Eliezer went on to become a leader of the Labor Party and defense minister. The threat that the unchecked attacks posed to the institutions and guardrails of Jewish democracy wasn't lost on some members of the Israeli elite. As the violence spread, a group of professors at Tel Aviv University and Hebrew University in Jerusalem sent a letter to Yitzhak Zamir, Israel's Attorney General. They were concerned, they wrote, that illegal private policing activity against the Palestinians living in the occupied territories presented a threat to the rule of law in the country.
Right, so these people concerned about the threat to the rule of law, they weren't threatened themselves by Palestinian violence, right? They lived in nice, cushy areas of Tel Aviv. So you see ethnic conflict in public schools, including the crown jewel of the California educational system, the UC campuses. So the University of California, especially UC San Diego, has been hammering applicants from Asian-dominated public schools because Asians tend to increasingly dominate in testing. So if you were just to admit students to your elite universities based on objective testing results, right, you'd have a lot more Asians, a few more whites, and far fewer blacks and Latinos. So Arcadia High School typically leads Los Angeles County Public Schools in National Merit Scholarship semifinalists. It's dominantly an Asian community, and they are very successful at sending their kids to elite UC schools. But now UC San Diego has been cracking down on Asian applicants, and instead they're boosting applicants from Black and Latino schools. So the number of Asian students getting into UC San Diego is way down. The number of Black and Hispanics students getting in way up. Similarly, at UC Medical School has been using dramatic amounts of affirmative action to boost Black and Latino enrollment in UCLA's medical school. As a result, for the first time, 50% of first-year UCLA medical students fail basic competency tests. So it used to be the tests were so simple that more than 90% of students would pass them. But now, thanks to massive affirmative action, 50% of UCLA's first-year medical school students are failing basic tests of competency.
The professors saw possible collusion between the settlers and the authorities. There is a suspicion that similar crimes are not being handled in the same manner, and some criminals are receiving preferential treatment over others. The signatories to the letter said, "This suspicion requires fundamental examination." The letter shook Zamir, who knew some of the professors well. He was also well aware that evidence of selective law enforcement, one law for the Palestinians and another for the settlers, would rebut the Israeli government's claim that the law was enforced equally.
Well, that's exactly what you have in America's major democratic strongholds, right? There's one law for people likely to vote Republican, another law for people who, if they vote, are more likely to vote for the Democrats. right, much laxer enforcement against Democrat voting population.
And could become both a domestic scandal and an international one. Zamir asked Judith Karp, then Israel's Deputy Attorney General for Special Duties, to lead a committee looking into the issue. Karp was responsible for handling the most delicate issues facing the Justice Ministry, but this would require even greater discretion than usual. As her team investigated, Karp says, "It very quickly became clear to me that what was described in the letter was nothing compared to the actual reality on the ground. She and her investigative committee found case after case of trespassing, extortion, assault, and murder, even as the military authorities and the police did nothing or performed notional investigations that went nowhere."
All right, let's go back to Filthy Armenian Adventures. And we have an episode here talking to Steve Saylor.
Limitations of audio cannot convey how deftly Steve was able to pirouette on our walk, spinning out of the entanglements of Lambo's leash. I could only aspire to pirouette with such ease. The audio had to be fixed pretty hard due to a sinister signal interference. Now, some of the eagles and birdies and holes in one. Borrowing from Chandler, I like to think of this one as a long hello, which continues after this brief word from our sponsor.
Come on, man. Come on, man. I'm trying to run a show. We can't afford.
Smoke break or secret locations and for.
Notice the pattern that gay men are not into golf to a almost startling degree.
Yeah, I don't think people have said, oh, that's just a stereotype, or golfers are pretending not to be gay, etc., etc. No, it's something that basically nobody noticed, just turns out to be true. I came up with it probably in the early 90s when I was looking at an article in the LA Times listing at different sports and how many athletes had died of AIDS during the worst 10 years. The highest per capita was like men's figure skating. And then a bunch of, and some associated arts, like choreography and fashion design.
Right.
Most of the other major sports had one or two modestly well-known players die of AIDS.
One sport had a player not die of AIDS.
Yeah.
With great, with magical flourish.
And but golf turned out to be nobody, zero.
Yeah.
So I've started to look at it. I've looked at like lists of, say, celebrity golfers, and
right. So gay people dominate certain sectors of American life, and other sectors of American life are dominated by straights. Other sectors of American life are dominated by Jews. Right. Some are dominated by Hindus. Right. Different groups have different gifts, but you understand. When you have a group moving into a neighborhood, right, you have an invasive species that takes over. It often is absolutely terrible for the natives.
I grew up in the Oakland Hills. I remember as a kid walking to the end of the street and overlooking the Caldecott Tunnel and this house that was just burnt down to a foundation. And I never really knew exactly what happened until I started doing research for this video. The Oakland Hills fire that we're going to talk about today killed 25 people, did $3.9 billion of damage, burned almost 3,500 homes to the ground, and is one of the most costly and deadly fires in the history of California. And the crazy thing is, it happened over the course of only 72 hours. Today we're going to be talking about the Oakland Hills fire of 1991 and the 100+ years of decisions that led to this tragedy, and what we can learn from this going forward when it comes to fire management and fire reduction. Growing up in the Bay Area, there was always this plant that you would see everywhere. It is growing in ditches, it's growing on the side of the road, and it's a beautiful tree. And I always just kind of assumed that whenever you see a tree that's around so frequently, you just kind of assume that it's native. And I always thought that this tree was a native California plant. It's not. It was the blue gum eucalyptus tree, and it is literally everywhere. This is a tree that dates back in California to the gold rush, when during those times, things were taking off so rapidly. People from all across the world were trying to come to the Bay Area in California to try to take advantage of this gold rush. So they needed to build rapidly, and the way they were going to do that is by using eucalyptus lumber to build a lot of the infrastructure that was going to be needed for this population boom that was incoming. And since California has a very similar climate to what was found in Australia, people at the time thought it might be a good way to bring the eucalyptus tree over and use it as a timber source for the foreseeable future. The problem is that once they realize what happens when you dry out the timber, it has a tendency to curl and twist, which makes it not very usable for the types of railroad building, houses, buildings. So it became a timber that was not very useful to the people that brought it across the Pacific Ocean in the first place. And since that point, eucalyptus, because of its similar climate to Australia, has done very well, and it is pretty much found everywhere. And according to the state of California, it is a moderate invasive species. Besides its prevalency, the thing that makes this a really nasty invasive species has to do with its reactions to being caught on fire. California is an area that burns down frequently, and
Right, so the interests of eucalypti are different from the interests of native life that suffer when competing with eucalypti.
The police and the IDF, in both action and inaction, were really cooperating with the settler vandals, Karp says. They operated as if they had no interest in investigating when there were complaints, and generally did everything they could to deter the Palestinians from even submitting them. In May 1982, Karp and her committee submitted a 33-page report determining that dozens of offenses were investigated insufficiently. The committee also noted that in their research, the police had provided them with information that was incomplete, contradictory, and in part false. They concluded that nearly half the investigations opened against settlers were closed without the police conducting even a rudimentary investigation. In the few cases in which they did investigate, the committee found profound flaws. In some cases, the police witnessed the crimes and did nothing. In others, soldiers were willing to testify against the settlers, but their testimonies and other evidence were buried.
Right, a little bit more on eucalypti as an invasive species here.
Fuck eucalyptus. Fuck this tree.
Eucalyptus trees and eucalyptus groves are everywhere in California. Planted by the millions by early settlers, eucalyptus trees remain a defining feature of California's landscape, despite a well-known and sadly well-documented history, including the devastating Oakland Hills fire, of being highly flammable.
You can't even use the wood for lumber. They use them for paper. Huge L, brought over by colonizers during the gold rush.
Planted forests of eucalyptus in the countryside of São Paulo state. They belong to Suzano Pulp and Paper, Brazil's biggest producer of cellulose, the raw material used to make paper products.
You guys always wonder why I say fuck eucalyptus. Look at this shit. They are so scary, they fall from wind easily.
Dozen largest trees that fell yesterday. One was a pine tree. The rest, take a look behind me. They all looked similar to this one. That's a eucalyptus tree.
And these redwoods are fine, of course. Fuck eucalyptus. Fuck this tree.
Eucalyptus trees and eucalyptus groves are everywhere in California. Planted by the millions by early settlers, eucalyptus...
It's a Look at all that invasive bullshit in Napa and Sonoma. You got these big-ass Tasmanian blue gum eucalyptus right next to the freeway waiting to fall on someone's car. None of this is native. This is all invasive. They're all tall and beautiful, I agree. But they're dangerous and they're allelopathic and they kill native plants. Look at all the dead shit. They burn and they fall and you cut that shit down, Sonoma. Fuck eucalyptus. Round 2, same town, same amount of invasive bullshit. Look how massive that invasive shit is. So big, that thing will smash your car and kill you. Beef. Look at all that
invasive tree that no one wants to talk about.
Fuck eucalyptus. Fuck this tree. Look at nothing growing around it. It's releasing oils that kills everything. Oh, but look, we got a little shit bag. Nice. Welcome to Gilroy. All right, we're in the middle of Gilroy. Super bleak, super boring. I just got off the freeway because I saw this guy right here. We got a sacred datura, hallucinogenic plant that will send you to Mars. We got some ants getting down, bro. Are you guys tripping? Damn, there's no seed pods though. I'm walking around in flip-flops, but we're good. Oh, that's so sick. This is in the nightshade family. You can tell from the leaves it's almost tomato-like. You see this plant, you don't want to mess with it. We'll give you about 50 years of therapy in 50 seconds. You don't deserve that kind of wisdom. Opening up an old bloom. See the stigma sticking out of that? Ooh!
Each spring, these yellow buttercups cover the forest floor in the northeastern US, and while they may seem beautiful, this plant is perhaps one of the most damaging invasives in the region at this time of year. It's called Lesser Celandine, or fig buttercup, and it's native to Europe. European colonizers first brought this plant to Philadelphia as a garden ornamental in 1867. Since then, it has spread throughout much of the eastern US, down to Fort Worth, Texas, destroying native spring ephemeral plants and forming dense mats in floodplains and on upland sites. It may
Right, I think it's a pretty good analogy how the Palestinians feel about West Bank Jewish settlers. I wonder what the United Nations has to say about the impact of eucalyptus tree.
This lush environment harbors dark secrets about the interconnectedness of life in its various forms. The waters of this stream nourish the soil, which in turn nourishes the ecosystem that dots
And let's say good morning. Welcome to Blessings to Elliott Blatt. What's going on, bro?
Blessings. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. It's been a couple of rough weeks for me. My voice is still afflicted. Bad cold for me, Luke. I got it. It went real deep, like to my larynx.
To your soul. I mean, do you get nihilistic when you're sick? Like, do you find that you cease caring about almost anything? Because I always experience profound nihilism during my illness.
Yeah, I had that exact. I'm like, why do people bother living? If this is possible, like, who can live like this?
Yeah.
Yeah, boy, this was the worst one ever, and so I got to do something. I got to take steps because I don't think I almost went to the hospital for the first time in my life.
Wow.
I thought, I had so much trouble breathing. I figured maybe I should go.
Did you have some comely female taking care of you the whole time?
Sadly not.
That's what makes illness, so much more difficult. If you had an attractive woman who loved you and took care of you during your illness, it would not nearly be as devastating.
That's right. A couple things. Can we switch to Rony Guldmann for a sec?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I listened to the stream yesterday, and you were all referring to an event, and I'm missing a part of the plot. What exactly did Rony Guldmann do to get himself ostracized the way he has been?
Okay, so to set it up, he arrived at Stanford Law School with a PhD in philosophy, and he'd published a book also in that realm with a distinctive publisher. So he arrives at Stanford Law, and he develops these ideas about why conservatives see themselves as oppressed. And his professors, Barbara Fried and her husband, Joseph Benkman-Fried, were intrigued and impressed by his work, and they arranged for him to get a fellowship that paid for not only all his tuition, but also gave him a stipend during his 3 years at Stanford Law. But he refused to follow the protocol. So there's a code for how you write with any group that you want to influence. And Barbara Fried and Joe Benkman-Fried, they saw Rony Guldmann as being on a track to get a tenure track position at a major law school, upon graduation. They grooming, they thought, a legal superstar, but Rony refused to follow the code. And the code is you flatter the people with power, you note their accomplishments in a particular field, and then you add something to it. And Rony Guldmann refused to follow that code. And so he encountered nothing but opposition. So let's say you wanted to devote your thesis to eucalypti as an invasive species. Well, you'd first note the preeminent academic research in the area. Like you would doff your cap. You would note, this person said this and this person said this. And then you would say, however, nonetheless, or on the surface, it appears that the views of this professor and this professor cannot be reconciled, but I would propose this. So after you first flatter the people with power, then you try to add something valuable to the existing conversation.
So is it that he disagreed and was rather curt about it, or was it that he just, as you said, failed to observe the protocol?
He was rude. So you can disagree in a polite way, or you can disagree in a rude way. And what he did came across as rude. And so, and that applies in all of life. It's not just academia, right? You can be rude to the people in power, or you can be polite to the people in power, and you're going to be much more successful if you're polite and you follow the code of how you disagree. So just like go ahead.
Well, were these people in power Barbara Fried or were these other people?
Well, Rony got into trouble with everyone who had power.
Okay.
Because he didn't follow the code, right? There's a code. You say nice things about the people in power, and then you offer something valuable.
But his scholarship was fine, right? It has nothing to do with his scholarship.
Right. The quality of his scholarship is pretty good, but he didn't follow the code. So he just alienated the people around him.
Now, what is his status now? Is he just is he not in academia at all?
He's not in academia. He's a personal injury lawyer, which is the less prestigious form of law.
Oh, he's an ambulance chaser. That is a fall from grace.
Yeah.
So are we going to see his face on billboards?
I don't
call Rony.
I don't think so, but I'm sure he earns a pretty good living, but you don't succeed when you violate the code, and he violated the code.
No, but isn't that in the nature of being a lawyer that you are a bit combative intellectually?
You're allowed to be combative, but you have to follow a code. You can't just be combative any which way you want to in a courtroom, right? There's a code for how you're allowed to be combative.
Yeah,
and there's a code for all of life.
Okay, so he's written 2 books, correct?
Well, yes.
The first book got him attention from Barbara Fried, right? And
he had a thesis. Maybe the first book got him some attention. His first book was on philosophy, so I'd have to look that up. So what was his other book? 2 Orientations Towards Human Nature. That was his philosophical book, and it came out. When did this come out? Oh, in 2016. So this was after he graduated Stanford Law. So he wrote a paper that got the attention of Barbara Fried and Joe Bankman.
I see. Okay. I do notice that in work, right? Today I'm at home. Today's a holiday. I'm at home, but I'm actually working today because it's one of the few days where I can work completely uninterrupted and really get stuff done because I don't have a single interruption. And I find that there's so much protocol in a very small company that I have to observe, and it really stymies my productivity. And it's a sort of cousin problem of this, is that people want to have meetings, people want to check in, people want to chit chat, right? They want to do all of these things, which I don't want to do, and they're directly impeding progress. And I'm always walking this line of trying to, recognize these as legitimate concerns, but it's the only source of frustration in my work is to observe these protocols. The actual work I do has no frustration whatsoever. It's actually quite enjoyable. And is this what I'm getting at? Is this part of like sort of feminization of culture, where it's about the collective and the whole and the group and not the individual.
No, I don't think it's primarily that. That even if you're part, if this was 60 years ago and you're working in a company, you still have to follow a code. Like if you're a Comanche Indian, you'd have to follow a code. If you were a samurai warrior, you'd have to follow a code. So feminization can influence codes, but the necessity of any group developing a code that you have to follow if you're going to be successful in that group is a universal and long-term essential part of human organization.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I've often got into trouble with this very thing. I have put the quality of my work product as my number one consideration and gotten fired because I didn't follow the code. So people have loved the quality of my work, but I still got fired because I didn't clock in and out at the correct times.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. That's all I had for the Rony Guldmann piece. So the other. So do you have Iceplant down there? Yeah, so back to eucalyptus. Do you know what Iceplant is? It's usually on the beach. It's sort of that waxy ground cover that's usually on the beaches.
Yeah.
I think it goes all the way down.
What's up, my plant?
That's also not. It's ubiquitous, right? It covers the entire coast of California, and it was originally planted. I think it was also imported from Australia, and it was planted as ground cover, because they were trying to disguise the beaches during World War II. So it's just funny that the two most notable features of California are invasive species.
Yeah.
But botanically speaking, I love eucalyptus, Dro. I can't bear these remarks about eucalyptus. I think it creates a nice scent in the air, and they're sort of beautiful trees in their sort of, primeval ruggedness,
Oh, I love them. I love hugging them. I was hugging eucalypti yesterday. I was walking around UCLA. There's some beautiful gardens at UCLA, and I was literally hugging eucalypti. But they're arrogant, and they run the banks and the movie industry.
No, I know. The EQ.
They think they're better than everyone else.
Yeah. All right. So, which bleeds into Steve Saylor and the sort of dissident right. I feel like there's a lot of legitimate, questioning of Jewish power that can be had here. But I think it's actually gone so far that it's stymied people's ability to think clearly. And JF was a really good example of that, where he showed that he's capable of thinking clearly, but he was basically criticizing Saylor for the point he was making 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And then attributing it to sort of malign Jewish influence, and I don't know. We have to be disciplined if we're going to talk about difficult things. I feel like you feel like he was playing to his audience, or do you just feel like he's just prone to fits of delusion?
Probably, it's probably audience capture. And I mean, the proposition that he was putting forward that Jews are incapable of following principle is, such an absurd position that if you ever get to that state, you've lost your mind. If you say that about any group, like about the Palestinians or about blacks or about Mexicans, that they're incapable of following principle, it's just such a self-evidently absurd claim.
Yeah, it totally is. And when I see first of all, when I look at JF, I just see the ghost of Mama JF sort of in his aura. I can't take him seriously the way I used to. I used to give him the benefit of the doubt, but then I don't know, something off about the guy. And then I noticed with Richard Spencer had him on as a guest recently, and they talked about it. And, JF was sort of jovial about it. And, either he can compartmentalize really well or he is truly a psychopath. But it's also weird. It just seems that era seems so far away. And now Richard Spencer is a sort of Joe Biden supporting liberal now. And JF is still this sort of libertarian right-wing guy. And the only thing that ties these two together are their critiques of Jews. And it just seems like a really weird thing that this one issue can make the strangest of bedfellows ideologically.
Well, also, I think they've only had good relations. So a lot of live streaming and podcasting is dominated by relationships. And so I think they've, to the best of my knowledge, they've never fallen out. And so they've always had each other's back. So I think there's a personal relationship there that transcends other considerations.
Yeah, maybe. Okay. Well, listen, my voice isn't as good as I thought. My voice had healed to the point where it was. I'm having difficulty speaking, so
Okay, bro.
I'm gonna have to drop.
Okay, bro.
All right. Thanks.
Cheers.
All right, take care.
Okay,
All right, bye.
take care. Okay, I want to get back to this New York Times article on West Bank settlers in Israel.
It soon became clear to Karp that the government was going to bury the report. We were very naive, she now recalls. Zamir had been assured, she says, that the cabinet would discuss the grave findings and had in fact demanded total confidentiality. The Minister of the Interior at the time, Yosef Burg, invited Karp to his home for what she recalls him describing as a personal conversation. Burg, a leader of the pro-settler National Religious Party, had by then served as a government minister in one office or another for more than 30 years. Karp assumed he wanted to learn more about her work, which could in theory have important repercussions for the religious right. But, to my astonishment, she says, he simply began to scold me in harsh language about what we were doing. I understood that he wanted us to drop it. Karp announced she was quitting the investigative committee. The situation we discovered was one of complete helplessness, she says. When the existence of the report, but not its contents, leaked to the public, Burg denied having ever seen such an investigation. When the full contents of the report were finally made public in 1984, a spokesman for the Justice Ministry said only that the committee had been dissolved and that the ministry was no longer monitoring the problem. 5. A wave of violence. On April 11, 1982, a uniformed IDF soldier named Alan Harry Goodman shot his way into the Dome of the Rock Mosque in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred sites for Muslims around the world. Carrying an M16 rifle, standard issue in the Israeli army, he killed 2 Arabs and wounded many more. When investigators searched Goodman's apartment, they found flyers for Kach, but a spokesman for the group said that it did not condone the attack. Prime Minister Begin condemned the attack, but he also chastised Islamic leaders, calling for a general strike in response, which he saw as an attempt to exploit the tragedy. The next year, masked Jewish underground terrorists opened fire on students at the Islamic College in Hebron, killing 3 people and injuring 33 more. Israeli authorities condemned the massacre, but were less clear about who would be held to account. General Ori Or, commander of Israeli forces in the region, said on the radio that all avenues would be pursued.
Okay, so what the heck has been going on with J.F. Gariépy and whatever happened to his wife?
And there's a lot of funny pieces about him, like funny pieces of lore about him. One piece of lore is that he got a $25,000 grant from Jeffrey Epstein for research. Like the Jeffrey Epstein who like was on the news, had like the island. Like that's the guy that gave this guy 25 grand. JF later becomes a YouTube streamer I think he had a show with Andy Worski. They had like a show together that was pulling crazy views, and they eventually ended up splitting up that show back in the day. But this is a good introduction, right before I call Nick, to the lore of JF. He has a particular taste in women. He has a particular taste in women, and it's not a taste that you guys are probably used to. Some guys like skinny chicks, some guys like fat chicks, some guys like girls with some big breastises, so to speak. Okay, JF likes them a little bit down. He likes the ones that are a little down. And this came out in like 2017. This was exposed.
In JF's own words, he convinced her to leave her family and join him in North Carolina. And then after 3 weeks of being with her, a girl that had never lived on her own, worked a job, lived apart from her parents, been in a relationship, he convinced her to try to have a child with him. 2 independent psychiatrists evaluated this girl. The first said that she had the social and mental skills of a 10 to 11-year-old child, and the second one said that she wasn't fit to make the decision.
Like, he literally is really into girls who are like mentally disabled.
That is insanely
like a pattern.
inappropriate for a 32-year-old guy to do that to a 19-year-old girl.
That's called love, you idiot.
Based. All right, Nick Diorio, let's have a call, buddy. Give me the sauce. Nicholas Diorio, how's it going?
You idiot. Hello.
It's called love. It's called love, Nicholas.
Dude, this guy has been around for years.
Well, back in the day, you did a video about JF.
In 2019, all right? In 2019, back when some of the articles were coming out. Dude, he is so interesting. Do you know he was a professor at Duke University and he got fired for fucking a student or something?
He got fired, and then I think they changed.
He wasn't a professor. He was a postdoc at Duke.
Changed the rule book based on what he did because he was having an inappropriate relationship with a grad student, which wasn't explicitly outlawed under the university law or whatever.
Dude, he used to do brain surgery on fucking monkeys.
So he is like smart. Like, he is kind of smart in some. Like, he is like a scientist. You have his book?
Yeah, I have the legendary phenotype. I own his book.
Isn't that like the racist book?
I'm gonna be honest with you. I can't read a word of it.
It's too much.
It's above me. Yeah, I think so.
Does he still have a YouTube channel?
No, he's banned.
He's banned?
He got hit in the big, like, far right demonetization wave that took out a few YouTubers, like back when Richard Spencer got hit. I think he got demonetized with Fuentes, and then I think they took him out around the time the conspiracy channels got banned. Yeah,
but this woman
I
think it's very cute.
I'm just gonna pull this up on.
Oh, it's very important to note these are 2 different women.
Yeah,
there is no information that the second woman is. But
the trans athletes,
we can watch the videos.
Just French.
We can watch the videos.
She's not just French.
Is charming with champagne on ice, but you stinky.
Mama Jeff, well, do you want some?
No, because we went to his mother's house, and after I drank so much this morning, and then I feel like, oh my god.
Oh, okay. Is she deaf?
Oh no, she's got an exquisite tongue.
But okay, she does. But he sounds like that. But he doesn't sound like rah, rah, rah. Like, I think she might be deaf, and like that's why.
Dude, if you can find it, when she talks to a YouTuber with the name of No White Guilt, that is the clip.
Okay.
It's Mama JF and No White Guilt.
No White Guilt. Isn't that one of Sam Hyde's top donators? NoWhiteGuilt.org.
It might be.
Mama JF's bizarre new claim: No White Guilt is a shape-shifting ghost. Is that what this is?
Maybe. I might just give you a timestamp or something, because unfortunately, this is one of the cases where I'm glad I made this video in 2019, because when his channel was deleted, a lot of this was lost, like forever. Do you want me to look for the clip where Medicare finds out for the first time that JF was?
Yes.
I have that clip, and I don't think anyone else in like the YouTube does.
And this guy is not a real person. He's doing shape-shifting.
What?
He's a ghost.
Wait, not a real person?
She's saying No White Guilt
she's
is
the original
ghost.
Dude, she's the original plain girl.
Dude, do you remember the part where there's some lore where she like locks JF in the basement for like a day?
You are not coming out of the basement.
I think she's on stream and he's like in the basement like knocking or something. Am I schizo remembering that?
Well, unfortunately now, Tom, it appears the tables have turned.
Okay, before we get into that, before we get into the murder rumors, we need to explain a little more lore. This girl is missing. This girl is missing, from what I know. And he made, there's this clip of him talking about it. He did a deep clean and renovation of his house like the day after she went missing, and like ran away.
Oh, I found it.
Hold on here. Okay. Here's the clip of him talking about what happened when she disappeared. Let's just have a look at this.
What matters in life, what matters most of life. And so what can I do? I cannot hate her. I cannot not be frustrated about this. And that's it. So that's why I had to take 3 days total to... I made so much cleaning, so much.
I couldn't be mad.
Pause for 1 second. You're missing a huge piece of context. The audio you're listening to is referencing events that happened in June. She was reported missing, not by JF, like this weekend. She's been gone for like
months.
3 or 4 months.
Three months. We'll give generous 3 months. Gone.
Jesus.
And this is him talking about remodeling his house.
Much reinstalling, so much plastering of the walls, construction, renovation. I wanted to set the home in the way I like it.
Set the home in the way. Okay, he seems like he's being weird. Does he not seem like he's being weird?
It's like sterilized this home.
It's sterilized. He said he uses the word sterilized.
What did she do? Lick them?
He uses the word sterilized.
Sterilize this home now. I can walk finally. I can access everything. The fridge is super clean.
Did she poop on the floor?
What matters in life.
I mean, that would probably turn him on, to be honest.
Have you ever seen the picture of her naked riding a bike in public?
I've seen the videos of her when she is painting 1488 on walls,
yeah,
and then she's saying "Hail Richard Spencer."
Dude, look at what I just sent you. That is lost media. Nobody has
For
Jean-François Gariépy.
Reason, and I don't even know why. Jeff started tweeting stuff that to me was not fun anymore about my past love relationships and about anything he could find to smear me.
This is the picture of him in a lab, by the way. Would you ever consider doing random tier charts on stream? I think it would be interesting to hear your opinion on random stuff. Yeah, maybe. Thanks for the 5.
He based on that story that I told him I told him about on the Drunken Peasant. And from that, I considered that Jeff was engaging in Twitter abuse, and I've blocked him.
He's talking about Jeff
That's
Holiday,
pretty much my story.
Okay, can I, since this is WWE, let me drop a shoulder from the top ropes. Jeff did respond with bringing something up. I have no idea what it is, but Jeff, I'd like your take on it since it's out there in the public specter, or public arena. Jeff, I'm paraphrasing because the tweet's deleted, but you said essentially JF is the guy that had to have the state intervene because he was too busy. What the f is that about?
Dude, look at Andy. Look at Andy, bro.
Look at his face. Dude, do you remember the clip when he's talking to Destiny? He's like, how was she?
That's this clip.
That's this clip?
Wait, keep playing.
So are you asking Jeff or me?
I'm asking you because I don't know any of this backstories, and I want to get your take on what's being out there.
Oh, well, when maybe a year or two ago, 2 years ago, I fell in love with a woman who was mentally retarded.
Yo, stop.
You didn't tell your audience this, but after he was fired from Duke, he was getting deported back to Canada. So the only way he'd be, theoretically, able to stay in the country is if he had ties here through, family stuff.
And the tie would be marriage to this girl.
And get a kid. Pop a kid out as fast as possible so Papa JF doesn't have to go back up north.
But I thought people thought it was a breeding thing where he was because of the eugenics is kind of fetishistic for him, so he likes to impregnate them.
But no, he's a eugenicist who believes in a white ethno-state, Tom. He thinks people should have blonde hair, blue eyes, and that's
then why is he with mentally disabled people, knocking them up?
Dude, that's what I was saying in chat. Who's more hypocritical? JF, who wants to create a perfect society and potatoes, or Hassan Piker, who's a socialist living in a mansion with a sports car? Realistically, they're two sides of the same coin.
Brittany Venti in chat says, wait, is his wife still missing? I heard his wife was found today or something, but the thumbnail was a picture of her edited to have scars all over her face. So I don't really know if it was she's just camping. I don't know if that was real though. Wendigoon, the answer is allegedly he killed his wife. Okay, I just need to play
Did you see the other picture? Wait, can you pull up the picture of the cow bones I sent you?
Okay, so he tweets out what is the date on this tweet? 11th of April. Okay, this is in fairness before she went missing. So this would be
this is before people thought she was gone.
He says, to celebrate Bitcoin rising to 30K and the leftists seething in my replies in response to facts about women, we have slaughtered a cow. Here are all the bones from the cow. Mama JF is preparing to boil these in order to extract all of their delicious nutrients. Are we looking at her corpse in this picture?
Dude, like an eyeball just rolled.
Are these too many bones?
Dude, would you put it past JF to murder his wife and put all the body parts on his kitchen countertop?
No, he would want to research them. He would definitely want to research them.
Dude, apparently he gets woken up every morning by feds.
Yeah, no. This guy was a monkey doctor? Yeah, at Duke. He was a monkey doctor.
She had autism.
And he got a grant from Jeffrey Epstein. Do we have a clip of him talking about...
I can pull it up. It's in my video, though. I don't know what Raw is.
If I just look up Jeffrey Epstein, there's a clip.
I looked it up. I don't have the clip, but I have a screenshot from a BuzzFeed article. So the context
isn't the clip in your video?
Yeah, I can get it from there. But the context that I have here is, so there was a BuzzFeed article that said this. J.F. Gariépy was a postdoctoral researcher in neuroscience at Duke University in 2014 when his nonprofit Neuro.tv received $25,000 from Jeffrey Epstein in order to make a series of YouTube interviews with experts in psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. The project is still, not anymore, the website has since been taken down, but you can find it on Wayback Machine.
Okay, people wondering whatever happened to J.F. Gariépy's wife. She went missing about a year ago. All right, let's look at the chat. Big Guy says, Luke refuses to talk about the Jewish soul because he doesn't have a Jewish soul. If he were a serious intellectual commentator, at least ethnically Jewish himself, he would know the Jewish soul is a series of discrete souls arranged in a microtubule structure, giving God a view of the world from the perspective of the minds of Jews. Jews aren't meant to rule the world as much as they give a guiding perspective. Luke Ford, read Gaetano Bosca's The Ruling Class, please. Yeah, I don't have any insights into the Jewish soul or the Japanese soul or the Australian soul. Back to this New York Times article on Israelis and their settlers on the West Bank and their disputes with the Palestinians there.
He added, "We don't have any description, and we don't know who we are looking for." The Jewish Department found itself continually behind in its efforts to address the onslaught. In April 1984, it had a major breakthrough. Its agents foiled a Jewish underground plan to blow up 5 buses full of Palestinians, and they arrested around 24 Jewish underground members who had also played roles in the Islamic College attack and the bombings of the Palestinian mayors in 1980. But only after weeks of interrogating the suspects did Shin Bet learn that the Jewish underground had been developing a scheme to blow up the Dome of the Rock Mosque. The planning involved dozens of intelligence-gathering trips to the Temple Mount and an assessment of the exact amount of explosives that would be needed and where to place them. The goal was nothing less than to drag the entire Middle East into a war.
Right, so you do want to control the settlers from dragging the whole Middle East into a war. On the other hand, from the perspective of many Israelis, a wider Middle East war would be to Israel's advantage because in such an intense conflict, right, Israel would feel more justified driving the Arabs out of the West Bank and out of Gaza, thereby creating a greater Israel that would be a more defensible and stronger Israel. But you can make strong arguments that enforcing the rule of law on the West Bank would enhance Israel's reputation in the world, would enhance Israel's standing in the world, and would allow for more possibilities of achieving some kind of lasting peace with the Palestinians.
Which the Jewish underground saw as a precondition for the coming of the Messiah. Carmi Gilon, who was head of Shin Bet's Jewish department at the time, says the fact that Shin Bet hadn't learned about a plot involving so many people and such ambitious planning earlier was an egregious intelligence failure. And it was not the Shin Bet, he notes, who prevented the plot from coming to fruition. It was the Jewish underground itself. Fortunately for all of us, they decided to forego the plan because they felt the Jewish people were not yet ready. Part 2. Warnings.
So with Israeli settlers, as with any insular in-group that develops particularly intense in-group identity, right, you can start to become detached from reality. So the idea that blowing up the Dome of the Rock would really be in Israel's best interests is difficult one to argue in that you would precipitate a war that would kill thousands upon thousands of Israelis.
6. Everything starts with the street. You have to understand why all this is important now. Ami Ayalon said, leaning in for emphasis. The sun shining into the backyard of the former Shin Bet director was gleaming off his bald scalp, illuminating a face that looked as if it were sculpted by a dull kitchen knife. We are not discussing Jewish terrorism. We are discussing the failure of Israel. Ayalon was protective of his former service, insisting.
So some people think the primary obligation of a state is to live up to abstract ethical moral principles, or to live up to its legal system, or to live up to some sort of ideals, to live up to its own ideals. Nationalists see the purpose of a state is to enhance the safety, first of all, and then the prosperity of a particular people. So what is your framework? What is your guide? Like, what is the basis for how you assess the efficacy of a state? Right? I am a nationalist. I believe the primary purpose of a state is to enhance the security and the prosperity of its particular people. I don't believe the primary purpose of a state is to live up to its ideals, to live up to its constitution, to live up to an abstract set of moral principles. I think the particular interests of its citizens should be the primary concern. That rather than policy being the focus of politics, the primary purpose of politics should be to enhance the prosperity and the safety and the identity, develop the identity, the sense of dignity of particular citizens of your state.
That Shin Bet, despite some failures, usually has the intelligence and resources to deter and prosecute right-wing terrorism in Israel. And he said they usually have the will. The question is why they are not doing anything about it, he said. And the answer is very simple. They cannot confront our courts. And the legal community finds it almost impossible to face the political community, which...
So courts tend to be dominated on the left in Israel, in the United States. All right, most institutions in the United States are dominated by the left. So if you're not on the left, why would you want left-wing institutions determining the most important issues in your state and for your particular people, right? Who would want to turn over to a hostile institution, right, power, right? Why would you want to give an institution that's inimical to your interests, right, the ability to determine the direction of your people?
Is supported by the street. So everything starts with the street. By the early 1980s,
everything starts with the street. That means how law affects a particular people is an important part of how the law is enforced. Who gets to carry out the law? Who has the power to determine, right, who gets prosecuted for violations of the law, right? That is shaped by conditions on the ground. It's true in major democratic cities, all right? The law is usually wielded in favor of democratic constituencies and often wielded against the interests of Republicans.
The settler movement had begun to gain some traction within the Knesset, but it remained far from the mainstream. When Kahana himself was elected to the Knesset in 1984, the members of the other parties, including Likud, would turn and leave the room when he stood up to deliver speeches.
And Big Guy says in the chat, Luke, you have a white Chinese soul. Instead of defaming Nick Fuentes' viewers as low IQ and his show as low class, you should air his clips and give him a fair hearing. Well, I showed his tweets where he's going after Steve Saylor, where his crew makes the case for denying the Holocaust, the single most documented genocide in human history. It's a whole series of idiotic positions that just show what a low IQ and low class show that he has. Do I really need to present more evidence on that score?
One issue was that the continual expansion of the settlements was becoming an irritant in U.S.-Israel relations.
So Jean-François Gariépy is a higher IQ version of Nick Fuentes, but JF makes clear that he and Nick are on the same page, right? They both, essentially hold that that Jews are incapable of following principles, which is a low IQ, low class perspective. The think that a particular ethnic group is simply incapable of following a principle is absurd. Right? There's no large group that is 100% incapable of following abstract principles.
During a 1982 trip by Begin to Washington, the Prime Minister had a closed-door meeting with the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations to discuss Israel's invasion of Lebanon that year, an effort to force out the PLO that had been heavy with civilian casualties. According to the Times' coverage of the session, Senator Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of Delaware, then in his second term, had an angry exchange with Begin about the West Bank, telling him that Israel was losing support in this country because of the settlements policy.
So Zionism is Jewish nationalism. Nationalism can be democratic or it can be authoritarian. And so the Democrats in the United States tend to be left to center, obviously, and they tend to support a more democratic version of Zionism, while people on the right will often prefer, in certain circumstances, a more authoritarian form of Zionism.
But Israeli officials came to understand that the Americans were generally content to vent their anger about the issue without taking more forceful action, like restricting military aid to Israel, which was then, as now, central to the country's security arrangements. After the Jewish underground plotters of the bombings targeting the West Bank mayors and other attacks were finally brought to trial in 1984, they were found guilty and given sentences ranging from a few months to life in prison.
Right. The primary way that you, as a society, decree how heinous certain behaviors are is how much you punish them. So if you punish murder with capital punishment, right, you're making a more dramatic statement about how heinous murder is than if you just give people, say, a 10-year sentence.
Plotters showed little remorse, though, and a public campaign swelled to have them pardoned. Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir also made the case for pardoning them, saying they were excellent, good people who have erred in their path and actions.
So, obviously, what determines a good person here is your particular hero system. Chat says, Nick Fuentes is a lot more entertaining than JF, but being kicked off YouTube accelerated Nick's descent into counter-Semitism. It's his main thing now. Yeah, Nick has definitely gone downhill over the years.
Clemency, Shamir suggested, would prevent a recurrence of Jewish terrorism. In the end, President Chaim Herzog, against the recommendations of Shin Bet and the Justice Ministry, signed an extraordinary series of pardons and commutations for the plotters. They were released and greeted as heroes by the settler community, and some rose to prominent positions in government and the Israeli media. One of them, Uzi Sharbov, now a leader in the settlement movement, was a speaker at a recent conference promoting the return of settlers to Gaza. In fact, nearly all the Jews involved in terror attacks against Arabs over the past decades have received substantial reductions in prison time. Gilon, the head of the Jewish department,
So by reducing the penalties for Jews committing terror and criminal violence against Palestinians, the Jewish state is saying that these crimes aren't so bad.
when some of these people were arrested, recalls the profound sense of injustice that he felt when they were released. But even more important, he says, was the question of what message the pardons convey to the public and to anyone who ever thinks about carrying out acts of terror against Arabs. 7. Operational failures. In 1987, a series of conflicts in Gaza led to a sustained Palestinian uprising throughout the occupied territories and Israel. The First Intifada, as it became known, was driven by anger over the occupation, which was then entering its third decade. It would
So for decades, supporters of Israel complained, why won't the Palestinians protest nonviolently? Then the Palestinians developed a particularly effective method of making their case, and that's BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, which aims to create a stranglehold on Israel and create the same sort of isolation that South African whites endured before they turned over their country to majority rule. And so there are just various ways of putting your foot on the neck of your opponent, right? BDS is a legal way. And, criminal acts of terrorism, different technique, but they're all aimed at securing more dignity and safety and prosperity for your particular group. And a lot of these competitions are zero sum, right? More security, more dignity, more safety, more prosperity for the Jewish state, in all likelihood, results in less dignity, less security, and less prosperity for its competitors, such as the Palestinians.
Simmer for the next 6 years, as Palestinians attacked Israelis with stones and Molotov cocktails and launched a series of strikes and boycotts. Israel deployed thousands of soldiers to quell the uprising. In the occupied territories, reprisal attacks between settlers and Palestinians were an increasing problem. The Gush Emunim movement had spread and fractured into different groups, making it difficult for Shin Bet to embed enough informants with the settlers. But the service had one key informant, a man given the code name Shaul. He was a trusted figure among the settlers and rose to become a close assistant to Rabbi Moshe Levinger, the Gush Emunim leader who founded the settlement in Hebron. Levinger had been questioned many times under suspicion of having a role in multiple violent attacks. But Shaul told Shin Bet operatives that they were seeing only a fraction of the whole picture. He told them about raids past and planned, about the settlers tearing through Arab villages, vandalizing homes, burning dozens of cars. The operatives ordered him to participate in these raids to strengthen his cover. One newspaper photographer in Hebron in 1985 captured Shaul smashing the wall of an Arab marketplace with a sledgehammer. As was standard policy, Shin Bet had ordered him to participate in any activity that didn't involve harm to human life. But figuring out which of the activities wouldn't cross that line became increasingly difficult.
Yeah, as it is for most people who are undercover among violent people. All right, let's check out some clips here from Nick Fuentes. He's got a channel on Rumble. Let's see if he's got a higher IQ and a higher class show than what I argued. Right here he's talking about the fake controlled right wing.
I got into it a little bit with Steve Saylor again. This guy's got to hate me. I'm just giving this guy a hard time. Honestly, I'm just giving him a hard time. And I don't trust him at all. I'm putting the screws in this guy big time because I think he's totally astroturfed. I think this whole program, I think his stupid book, I think his tour, I think it's totally astroturfed. And honestly, I am really sick of these philo-Semite, Mischling, Zionist Jews who are racist, pretending that they are the vanguard of dissent in the United States. You're freaking not, okay? There's nothing dissident about being a secular philo-Semite rightist who believes in human biodiversity or crime statistics. I'm just...
Yeah, the idea that Steve Saylor hasn't fought a lonely, distant fight is absolutely absurd. The idea that philo-Semite is, a pretty accurate description of Steve Saylor is absurd. He's philo-Semitic in some ways, and he's Jewishly critical in other ways. So Nick is just completely divorced from reality here.
Just over it. This whole V-Dare, Steve Saylor, Passage Press, Lomez, Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, Costin Alamaru, J.D. Vance, Jack Posobiec thing. I think the whole thing is a big fucking deception, and I've just had it. I posted a big, I don't want to say an essay, but I posted some of these breadcrumbs on my Telegram earlier today. I just kind of laid out some of the connections. And I know for a lot of people it might be difficult to follow along because I know a lot of people maybe don't know all the players involved and maybe haven't heard of everybody involved. But I've been doing this for a long time. I've heard a lot of rumors. I'm aware of a lot of intel on this kind of stuff. And I'm noticing a pattern here, which is that it seems to be a very deliberate and concerted effort to prop up another phony right wing that is controlled by Jewish people.
And we have a comment in the chat. If there's a single episode of his show where he doesn't, at least in passing, talk about Jews, I haven't seen it. This has been his main focus for the past few years.
And look, I know that it sounds like hammer and nail. You know, if you're a hammer, every problem's a nail. I know that's what it sounds like, but that's also what it is. Okay? I don't want to sound like a broken record. I don't want to sound like it's a one-word answer to every problem. But everywhere you look, you just...
Okay, so we're 2.5 minutes into this Nick Fuentes commentary, and he hasn't said anything important or valuable yet. It's just a moronic quality of discourse.
Just see, it's like I always say, you just find more of it. So like with Steve Saylor, I didn't trust this guy to begin with. And I had a feeling that V. Dare, who has promoted...
Okay, this idea, I don't trust this person, or I don't trust that person. We should put people in their proper genre and trust them as far as their level of expertise. So Steve Saylor isn't a medical doctor, right? So you shouldn't expect, medical quality advice from Steve Saylor, right? Steve Saylor has certain habits, he has certain predictable interests, and in those interests, he has an enviable track record.
Saylor for decades. I had a feeling they were maintaining distance with me. And then I hear some of the stuff that's going on, like a...
Oh, why would Steve Saylor want to maintain distance from someone who puts out a moronic quality show? Right, Steve Saylor wants to maintain distance from the guerrilla mindset guy. Who's the guerrilla mindset guy? But, Steve Saylor wants to maintain a distance from a lot of people. He has not answered any of my interview requests, so I assume he wants to maintain distance from me as well.
Amanda Milius is over there, and Ryan Gerdusky's over there, and they're asking Ashley St. Clair to be the speaker. And then I read Steve Saylor's blog post from 20 years ago. He says that he believes that he's Jewish, and he performed a DNA test and confirmed it, and he's effective.
Yeah, he believes that he's partly genetically Jewish. All right, he's adopted, he had a DNA test, and part of his DNA is Jewish.
A philo-Semite and pro-Israel. And it's like, okay, but why does it always have to be like that? If it wasn't like that, well, I would say as much. But it's all...
So if you admire innovation, if you admire scientific advances, if you admire entrepreneurship, if you admire intellectual achievement, then in all likelihood, you're going to have some respect for Jews, right? There will be a part of you who admires Jewish excellence. Doesn't mean that you won't find numerous areas where you also criticize Jews, but Jews have a great deal of accomplishment in some intellectual, scientific, and entrepreneurial arenas. And if one, values that kind of advancement, then you're going to have some positive feelings about Jews.
Always like this. Same thing with the Lomez guy. I got told behind the scenes, oh, Lomez actually likes you. He's never talked about me once, ever. The only time he talked about me 2 years ago was to say that I'm talented, fact, but that I need someone to restrain me. Why? I've heard that one before. Oh, I need someone to restrain me. What, like a handler? He's tweeted, I don't know, tens of thousands of times, been in the space.
So it sounds like his main burn with Steve Saylor and Lomez and the intellectual dissident right is that they don't publicly support and praise Nick Fuentes. It seems to be the main burn that he has. And then he just seeks for reasons to justify his resentment.
Apparently he's a Jew, but he's apparently a big fan.
Right. What we're hearing here is a plea for dignity. Right. Nick doesn't want to be regarded as low class and as putting out a low IQ show. He wants to be respected as one of the leading intellectuals of the dissident right. And the leading intellectuals of the dissident right don't respect Nick. They may appreciate his showmanship talent, but they recognize that he's putting on a moron quality show.
He gets all his money from Peter Thiel. He promotes Curtis Yarvin, another Jew. No, but he's one of the good ones. He's a big fan. Only time he's ever said my name is to say, well, somebody's got to hold this guy back. And then you go through his timeline, he doesn't have nothing to say about Israel, nothing to say about Jewish people, nothing to say about any of this stuff. Then he gets doxxed, and he makes the rounds on Steve Bannon and Jack Posobiec. And Darren Beattie says, cancel culture's over. It's like, yeah, not for Groypers. When Groypers get doxxed, they just get screwed. They don't get invited on shows. They don't get invited on Steve Bannon. They don't get a promo code. They just get screwed. And they can't give...
Yeah, because Groypers often act in a moronic fashion. And so they are considered off limits to certain segments of the right wing.
Work, and they get fired by wherever.
Right. Nick doesn't want to take any responsibility for his own choices, his own rhetoric, and the way he's led his own movement down some blind alleys. And so he would much rather displace his anxiety, his resentment about the lack of dignity that he feels, the lack of respect that his movement has accumulated. He can't live with this anxiety that he's made some bad choices. And so he wants to displace his anxiety and to blame these other right-wing figures.
Ever. So I think cancel culture is only over if you have patronage from billionaire Peter Thiel, who's a federal informant and a contractor for the intelligence community, and if you're a Jew. I think those are the people for which cancel culture is over.
So Nick is outraged that Israel attacked and killed a leading Hamas commander. So this is at the top of Nick Fuentes' feed right now. Israel orders Palestinian civilians to evacuate, then bombs them inside their tents when they go to hide. This isn't self-defense. This is a massacre. The United States must bring Israel to heel and stop these horrific war crimes being committed with American support. Number one, America doesn't have the ability to stop Israel's attack against Hamas, and killing Hamas leaders who ordered attacks on Israel is a form of self-defense. Right? No sovereign country would permit rockets and bombs being sent in their direction by their neighbors. Right? Every sovereign country would take steps to end the bombing, and that's exactly what Israel's doing. So at a certain point, right, if you have the ability to kill a leading commander of the enemy, but it's going to take some civilian casualties, you do have to weigh things up. Overall, from all the evidence I've seen, Israel's done an extraordinary job at keeping civilian casualties low compared to the number of Hamas militants that they've killed. Right? I don't know anyone else who has done a superior job at keeping civilian casualties low when fighting in this kind of urban setting.
Not so much for any loyal Americans or Christians for that matter. And then Jack Posobiec's Human Events. You know, Jack Posobiec is doing this kind of cutesy thing. I don't really know what the play is, but, you know, he's playing these games where he's pretending like he's saying Talmud and stopping himself and playing these, I don't know, he must think he's really clever. He's the senior editor at Human Events, which must have changed hands from Will Chamberlain and Raheem Kassam at some point. And today they publish a big hit piece about me from Rabbi Barkley, the same rabbi that called Candace Owens a Jew-hating anti-Semite. And they publish an op-ed saying Donald Trump should disavow Jake Shields and Nick Fuentes and Kanye and the Groypers. From Rabbi Barkley, like I said, the smear merchant.
Okay, so we're 6 minutes into this Nick Fuentes video, and it's overwhelmingly resentment that he isn't getting the respect and dignity that he deserves. But there is no intellectual content. There's nothing valuable in what he's saying. It's just resentment at his feeling of a lack of dignity. So this is pretty much what I expected from Nick Fuentes. He is fluent, right? He dispenses words very easily. He's entertaining and often funny, but it's low IQ, moronic content.
The majority of the activists were lunatics, riffraff, and it was very difficult to be sure they wouldn't hurt people and would harm only property, Shaul said. Shaul, who's...
Yeah, activists who are going to commit violence, all right, will tend to be lower IQ, right? People who have a great deal to preserve and to protect are not going to go out there and commit, you know, reckless acts of violence. So these protesters, all right, you don't think these people have jobs lined up in merchant banking, right? I don't suspect that they have guaranteed admittance to elite law schools and medical schools, right? They're not exactly the cognitive elite who are leading the way of these pro-Palestine protests. On the other hand, the more you have to protect with the status quo. If you just have a flourishing social life, a flourishing love life, flourishing academic life, you've got a beautiful career lined up for yourself. If you love your life, if you're happy, right, you're much less likely to risk everything by engaging in campus protests.
True identity remains secret, provided these quotes in a 2015 interview with Bergman for the Israeli Hebrew language paper Eediot Ahronot. Some of his account is published here for the first time. In September 1988, Rabbi Levinger, Shaul's patron, was driving through Hebron when, he later said in court, Palestinians began throwing stones at his car and surrounding him. Levinger flashed a pistol and began firing wildly at nearby shops. Investigators said he killed a 42-year-old shopkeeper, Kayed Salah, who had been closing the steel shutter of a shoe store, and injured a second man.
Right. If you're being attacked by rocks, they have the ability to kill you. And it'd be understandable if someone would react with violence to being violently attacked.
Levinger claimed self-defense, but he was hardly remorseful. I know that I am innocent, he said at the trial, and that I didn't have the honor of killing the Arab. Prosecutors cut a deal with Levinger. He was convicted.
Right. People with an intense in-group identity are not going to have a lot of empathy for out-groups, right? This rabbi sounds like he has an intense in-group identity. He feels that he and his people are engaged in a life and death struggle with the Palestinians, and it's not surprising that he would lack empathy for his enemy.
Of criminally negligent homicide, sentenced to 5 months in prison and released after only 3. Shin Bet faced the classic intelligence agency's dilemma: how and when to let its informants participate in the very violent acts the service was supposed to be stopping. There was some logic in Shin Bet's approach with Shaul, but it certainly didn't help deter acts of terror in the West Bank, especially with little police presence in the occupied territories and a powerful interest group ensuring that whoever was charged for the violence was released with a light sentence.
Well, why is there a modern state of Israel? In part because the founders of the modern state of Israel committed terror, right? They committed ethnic cleansing against Arabs. They committed terror killings against the British, right? What modern states are founded without violence, right? That founding a state with violence is pretty much the norm in human history, including in the 20th century.
His many years as a Shin Bet mole, Shaul said, he saw numerous intelligence and operational failures by the agency. One of the worst, he said, was the December 1993 murder of 3 Palestinians in an act of vengeance after the murder of a settler leader and his son. Driving home from a day of work in Israel, the 3 Palestinians, who had no connection to the deaths of the settlers, were pulled from their car and killed near the West Bank town Tarkumia.
Okay, the world tends to work in a collective fashion, right? People don't tend to see people primarily as individuals, right? The world tends to primarily see people as members of groups, of extended families. And so when your enemy, right, kills one key part of your group, then in all likelihood there's going to be some kind of collective response. So almost nothing we think and feel is ours alone, right? We depend upon cues from our group, right? We experience reality through our group identity. It's absolutely essential to have an identity. Whether you identify primarily as gay or as Christian or Jewish or Japanese, right? We all tend to see the world through the lens of our primary group identity. And so John Mearsheimer wrote a great 2018 book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. And he says, we are profoundly social beings from the start to the finish of our lives. Individualism is of secondary importance. Right? Liberalism downplays the social nature of human beings to the point of almost ignoring it, instead treating people largely as atomistic actors, as though people have this buffered identity where they can just decide right and wrong and meaning and purpose just on their own, completely buffered from other people. Okay, that's very different from the nationalist, tribal, or traditional perspective that we were primarily members of extended families, of tribes, and of nations. So political liberalism, the dominant ideology in America, is an ideology that is individualistic at its core, and it assigns great importance to the concept of individual inalienable rights. And this concern for these individual inalienable rights is the basis of its universalism, that everyone on the planet has the same inherent set of rights. And this is what motivates liberal states to pursue ambitious foreign policies. All right, human rights have come to define the most elevated aspirations of both social movements and political entities. They evoke hope and provoke action. But human beings do not tend to operate as lone wolves. We are born into social groups that shape our identities well before we can assert our individualism. We usually grow up to develop strong attachments to our family, extended family, and to our group. And it's normal to be willing to make great sacrifice for our family and extended family. Right? We are tribal to the core. Right? We are social because the best way for us to survive is to be embedded in a group and to cooperate with the group rather than to act alone. Right? Reason is the least important of the three ways that we determine our preferences. Right? It's less important than socialization. It's less important than our genetic predispositions. Right? Socialization matters because humans have a long childhood in which they are protected and nurtured by families and extended families, and they are exposed to intense socialization. They only begin to develop their critical faculties in their 20s, right? And they're not equipped early on to think for themselves. By the time the individual reaches, say, 25, where his reasoning skills are well developed, his family and his society have already imposed an enormous value infusion on him. Also, the individual is born with innate sentiments coming from his genetics that strongly influence how he thinks about the world around him. So people have very limited choice in formulating their moral code in what they consider right and wrong or heroic, because our thinking about right and wrong and what is heroic comes largely from inborn attitudes and socialization.
Shaul recalled how one settler activist proudly told him that he and two friends committed the murders. He contacted his shin bet handlers to tell them what he had heard. And suddenly I saw they were losing interest, Shaul said. It was only later that he learned why. Two of the shooters were shin bet informants. The service didn't want to blow their cover, or worse, to suffer the scandal that two of its operatives were involved in a murder and a cover-up.
Yeah, groups are incredibly self-interested. And most groups tend to put a higher priority on the well-being of their particular group and much less priority on the well-being of enemy groups.
Statement, Shin Bet said that Shaul's version of events is rife with incorrect details, but refused to specify which details were incorrect. Neither the state prosecutor nor the attorney general responded to requests for comment, which included Shaul's full version of events and additional evidence gathered over the years. Shaul said he also gave numerous reports to his handlers about the activities of yet another Brooklyn-born follower of Meir Kahane and the Jewish Defense League, Dr. Baruch Goldstein. He earned his medical degree at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, and in 1983 immigrated to Israel, where he worked first as a physician in the IDF, then as an emergency doctor at Kiryat Arba, a settlement near Hebron. In the years that passed, he gained the attention of Shin Bet with his eliminationist views, calling Arabs latter-day Nazis, and making a point to visit the...
Right, it's not shocking when two groups seem to be in a fight to the death, as Jewish Israelis and Palestinians seem to be, that either side would want to eliminate the other side, because the mere existence of the other side in your territory is understandably regarded as a threat. So most Palestinians would wish that the Jewish Israelis in Israel would get up and leave. And Israelis wish that the Palestinian Arabs would leave.
Jewish terrorist Ami Popper in prison, where he was serving a sentence for the 1990 murder of 7 Palestinians in the Tel Aviv suburb Rishon LeZion. Shaul said he regarded Goldstein at the time as a charismatic and highly dangerous figure, and repeatedly urged the Shin Bet to monitor him. They told me it was none of my business, he said. 8. Clean hands. On February 24, 1994, Goldstein abruptly fired his personal driver. According to Shaul, Goldstein told the driver that he knew he was a Shin Bet informer. Terrified at having been found out, the driver fled the West Bank immediately. Now Goldstein was moving unobserved. That evening marked the beginning of Purim, the festive commemoration of the victory of the Jews over Haman the Agagite, a court official in the Persian Empire and the nemesis of the Jews in the Old Testament's Book of Esther.
So in the Book of Esther, which we don't have any evidence historically happened, the Jews are threatened with being wiped out by Haman and his supporters, and they manage to outwit Haman, and then they take revenge on their enemies, and they kill thousands upon thousands of their enemies. This is the normal course of human history. If you think that your enemy is planning to wipe you out and you gain the upper hand, people don't usually react to that with magnanimity.
Right-wing Israelis have often drawn parallels between Haman and Arabs, enemies who seek the annihilation of Jews. Goldstein woke early the next day and put on his IDF uniform.
So it's not genetically inherent in people to be driven to annihilate, other people, except in certain circumstances, right? If you feel like you're in a fight for survival and it's either your group or the enemy group, then people are strongly incentivized to go out and kill. But if there weren't Jewish Israelis in the Middle East, or if there weren't Palestinian Arabs threatening the safety and existence of the Jewish state, then you wouldn't have these eliminationist tendencies on both sides.
And at 5:20 a.m., he entered the Cave of the Patriarchs, an ancient complex in Hebron that serves as a place of worship for both Jews and Muslims. Goldstein carried with him his IDF-issued Galil rifle. It was also the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, and on that morning hundreds of Muslims crowded the hall in prayer. Goldstein faced the worshippers and began shooting, firing 108 rounds before he was dragged down and beaten to death. The massacre killed 29 Muslim worshippers and injured more than 100.
So ties bind and blind, right? Baruch Goldstein had an intense in-group identity, but that's usually a wonderful way to go through life, but it does blind you. And so when you enjoy that intense in-group identity, you stop thinking about how your words and how your behavior is viewed by outsiders. So I remember one time I was walking around in West L.A. with an Israeli friend, and he started yelling, death to the Arabs, right? Which is not a good thing to be yelling out in America. Probably not a good thing to be yelling out in Israel. But that's what happens when you have this intense in-group identity. You feel under threat from the enemy, the Arabs, and so you react with revulsion, and you don't consider how your words and how your behavior is going to be interpreted by people outside of your own group. So it's always good if you got this intense in-group identity to also take some time to step outside of your identity mentally and consider, how will my words, how will my actions be seen by those outside my group who don't have an agenda in either direction?
Killings shocked Israel, and the government responded with a crackdown on extremism. Kach and Kahana High, the two political organizations most closely affiliated with the Kahanist movement, were outlawed and labeled terrorist groups, as was any other party that called for the establishment of a theocracy in the biblical land of Israel and the violent expulsion of Arabs from that land.
So whenever I do a video on Destiny, I get about 4 times the number of normal viewers. And I got a lot of intense pushback from Destiny fans about my claim that the average IQ of my audience is about 130 and that the average IQ of Destiny's audience is about 100. So here are some of the comments. using an anecdotally sourced sample of probably no more than 30 university professors to claim that your audience must have an average IQ of 130 is a very 90 IQ move. Another comment. Anyone throwing overly specific percentages and estimates is LARPing the aesthetic of being highly specific and knowledgeable, but it only proves they're making everything up. This also goes for rating things. Unless you sit down and do some math, you're not eyeballing any real and consistent difference between a 7 or an 8 out of 10, let alone pretending people that they are, 100 points IQ or more on a scale. Another comment. Guys, I swear the reason I have no viewers is just because I'm drawing from a smaller, higher IQ population size and not because I'm a pseudo-intellectual hack. Next comment. Me, listen, your show all time. Me, IQ is 52. You factor me into your order. Awesome average IQ score, Mr. Sir. Another comment. I was going to simply leave a snarky and undeniably hilarious comment about how dumb I am, but I actually found quite a lot of your show yesterday quite interesting. As an added bonus, the live chat replay, although intellectually underwhelming, is full of gold. Next comment. Your video-based cognitive enhancement protocol has catalyzed a significant augmentation in my cognitive processing capabilities, quantifiably translating into a net increase of 60 IQ points, effectively doubling my pre-intervention baseline of 60 IQ. This neuroplasticity-induced transformation evidences the efficacy of your didactic methodologies in neural synaptic potentiation and cognitive function optimization. Next comment. I feel myself compelled to interject and elucidate a point of critical importance regarding the purportedly average cognitive quotient, colloquially known as IQ, of the audience of the esteemed broadcaster known as Destiny. It is with a modicum of modesty that I assert my own intellectual faculties are so prodigiously developed that my inclusion in this demographic cohort single-handedly augments the mean IQ of said audience to a robust 103. However, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the statistical faux pas committed in the reliance upon the mean as a measure of central tendency in this context. The median, the far more resilient statistic to the outliers such as myself, would have provided a more accurate representation of central cognitive prowess, thus precluding any undue influence of extreme values on our understanding. Thus, I jestingly chide myself and others for not initially opting for the median in our discussions. Next comment. Thank you for bequeathing your invariably eloquent solutions upon mine ear, from which I've now gained 47.82 duly fabricated intelligence quotient points. Tip-top, cheerio. Sir, I am a Destiny fan, and my IQ is 165. Surely that has to account for something on the average more positive.
Rabin, in an address to the Knesset, spoke directly to the followers of Goldstein and Kahana, who he said were the product of a malicious foreign influence on Israel. You are not part of the community of Israel, he said. You are not partners in the Zionist enterprise. You are a foreign implant. You are an errant weed. Sensible Judaism spits you out. You placed yourself outside the wall of Jewish law. Following the massacre, a state commission of inquiry was appointed, headed by Judge Meir Shamgar, the president of the Supreme Court. The commission's report, made public in June 1994, strongly criticized the security arrangements at the Cave of the Patriarchs and examined law enforcement practices regarding settlers and the extreme right in general. A secret appendix to the report, containing material deemed too sensitive for public consumption, included a December 1992 letter from the Israeli Commissioner of Police, essentially admitting that the police could not enforce the law. The situation in the districts is extremely bleak, he wrote, using the administrative nomenclature for the occupied territories. The ability of the police to function is far from the required minimum. This is as a result of the lack of essential resources. In its conclusions, the Commission, tracing the lines of the previous decade's CARP report, confirmed claims that human rights organizations had made for years, but that had been ignored by the Israeli establishment. The commission found that Israeli law enforcement was ineffective in handling complaints, that it delayed the filing of indictments, and that restraining orders against chronic criminals among the hardcore of the settlers.
Yeah, so why in a life and death struggle between Arabs and Israelis would the Jewish state be not terribly interested in the complaints of Palestinians? It just makes sense that in this kind of life and death struggle, that one is going to be less concerned with the complaints of a group that belongs to the enemy.
Were rarely issued. The IDF refused to allow Goldstein to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Hebron. He was buried instead in the Kiryat Arba settlement, in a park named for Meir Kahane, and his gravesite has become an enduring place of pilgrimage for Jews who wanted to celebrate, as his epitaph reads, the saint who died for Israel with...
So why on earth would they celebrate, someone like Baruch Goldstein? Well, people tend to venerate those who they see as fighting for their cause. Right? They're not necessarily primarily celebrating the slaughter of innocent people at prayer. They're celebrating that this is a valiant fighter for our cause. And in a time of conflict, right, the more likely you are to have an intense veneration of people you see as fighting for your side.
Clean hands and a pure heart. 9. A curse of death. One ultra-nationalist settler who went regularly to Goldstein's grave was a teenage radical named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who would sometimes gather other followers there on Purim to celebrate the slain killer.
So South Africa had a civil war operating for decades. Nelson Mandela was leading the fight against the white government of South Africa. But then when a settlement was reached, right, Nelson Mandela switched from leading an armed conflict to leading a peaceful solution to South Africa. So many of these most bloodthirsty, violent individuals in a different circumstance, they change, right? People react to situations. So when people move out of a life and death struggle, right, they are going to lean away from violent solutions and look towards often more cooperative solutions. So much of our behavior and much of the intensity of our emotions is going to be driven by our situation rather than some inherent quality in our soul.
Purim revelers often dress in costume, and on one such occasion, caught on video, Ben-Gvir even wore a Goldstein costume, complete with a fake beard and a stethoscope. By then, Ben-Gvir had already come to the attention of the Jewish department, and investigators interrogated him several times. The military declined to enlist him into the service expected of most Israeli citizens. After the massacre at the Cave of the Patriarchs, a new generation of Kahanists directed their anger squarely at Rabin for his signing of the Oslo Agreement and for depriving them, in their view, of their birthright.
So Kahanists, another way of understanding supporters of Meir Kahane, you're looking at people who are 10 out of 10 in their intensity, in their in-group identity. And Likud voters, for example, would be people you could understand as being like 7 or 8 out of 10 in the intensity of their in-group identity. And left-wing voters in Israel would be people who'd be like 5 out of 10 in their in-group intensity. So in the United States, right, Republicans are going to have more intense in-group identities as Americans than Democratic voters who will have a more international perspective, less nationalist perspective, right? People on the right tend to be more nationalist. They tend to prefer traditional solutions. They tend to have more veneration for traditional ways of doing things. They tend to have loyalties that are concentric, right? Starting with themselves, their family, their extended family, their community, their friends, their town, their state, and their nation, right? Their loyalties are concentric, as opposed to people on the left who often have leapfrogging loyalties where their primary loyalty may be to themselves and then to their LGBTQ identity and then to, say, oppressed lesbians in Uganda. So their loyalties will like leapfrog across the world to some other oppressed group.
From my standpoint, Goldstein's action was a wake-up call. Says Hezi Kalo, a longtime senior Shin Bet official who oversaw the division that included the Jewish department at that time. I realized that this was going to be a very big story. That the diplomatic moves by the Rabin government would simply not pass by without the shedding of blood. The government of Israel was finally paying attention to the threat, and parts of the government acted to deal with it. Shin Bet increased the size of the Jewish department, and it began to issue a new kind of warning. Jewish terrorists no longer threatened only Arabs. They threatened Jews. The warnings noted that rabbis in West Bank settlements, along with some politicians on the right, were now openly advocating violence against Israeli public officials, especially Rabin. Extremist rabbis issued rulings of Jewish law against Rabin, imposing a curse of death, a pulsa denura, and providing justification for killing him, a din rodef. Carmi Gilon by then had moved on from running the Jewish department and now had the top job at Shin Bet. Discussing and acknowledging such halachic laws was tantamount to a license to kill, he says now, looking back. He was particularly concerned about Benjamin Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon, who were stoking the fury of the right-wing rabbis and settler leaders in their battles with Rabin. Shin Bet wanted to prosecute rabbis who approved the religiously motivated death sentences against Rabin, but the state attorney's office refused. They didn't give enough importance back then to the link between incitement and legitimacy for terrorism, says.
So it's not weird that people would consider members of their own group often a bigger threat to the well-being of their group than they would consider outsiders, right? Sometimes insiders in your group, particularly if you feel like they're leading your group in a dangerous direction, right, it'd be no more natural and healthy to regard these members of your in-group as more dangerous to you than out-group members.
Former prosecutor who worked in the state attorney's office in the mid-1990s. Shin Bet issued warning after warning in 1995. This was no longer a matter of mere incitement, but rather concrete information on the intention to kill top political figures, including Rabin, Kahlo now recalls. In October of that year, Ben-Gvir spoke to Israeli television cameras holding up a Cadillac hood ornament which he boasted he had broken off the prime minister's official car during chaotic anti-Oslo demonstrations in front of the Knesset. "We got to his car," he said, "and we'll get to him too." The following month, Rabin was dead.
Right. That's why if you're serious about protecting law and order, right, you have to punish those who throw water or throw pies or throw anything at people, right? Once you start allowing disorder and softer forms of assault and you don't crack down and punish that, right, you are incentivizing more vicious forms of assault.
10. Conspiracies. Yigal Amir, the man who shot and killed Rabin in Tel Aviv after a rally in support of the Oslo Accords on November 4, 1995, was not unknown to the Jewish department. A 25-year-old studying law, computer science, and the Torah at Bar Ilan University near Tel Aviv, he had been radicalized by Rabin's efforts to make peace with Palestinian leaders and had connections to Avishai Raviv, the leader of Eyal, a new far-right group loosely affiliated with the Koch movement. In fact, Raviv was a Shin Bet informant, codenamed Champagne. He had heard Amir talking about the justice of the Din Rodef judgments, but he did not identify him to his handlers as an immediate danger. "No one took Yigal seriously," he said later in a court proceeding. "It's common in our circles to talk about attacking public figures." Lior Ackerman was the first Shin Bet investigator to interrogate Amir at the detention center where he was being held after the assassination. There was, of course, no question about his guilt. But there was the broader question of conspiracy. Did Amir have accomplices? Did they have further plans? Ackerman now recalls asking Amir how he could reconcile his belief in God with his decision to murder the Prime Minister of Israel. Amir, he says, told him that rabbis had justified harming the prime minister in order to protect Israel. Amir was smug, Ackerman recalls, and he did not respond directly to the...
All right, belief in God doesn't transform people's morality. All right, there's absolutely no evidence that democracies, for example, wage wars in a more humane fashion than non-democracies, and there's no evidence that monotheists wage wars in a more humane fashion than non-monotheists. So it sounds good, right? You attempted, if you're a religious person, to believe that religiosity and faith in God are going to make people, less likely to do heinous things. I just don't think that we have sufficient evidence for that assertion. I don't know. How would you say that monotheistic countries like England, United States, France, Germany, why on earth would you regard them as more humane in the ways they wage war?
Question of accomplices. Listen, he said, according to Ackerman, I succeeded. I was able to do something that many people wanted, but no one dared to do. I fired a gun that many Jews held, but I squeezed the trigger because no one else had the courage to do it. The Shin Bet investigators demanded to know the identities of the rabbis. Amir was coy at first.
So Orthodox rabbis will often countenance almost anything if they believe that it will encourage more observance of Torah, or if they believe it is in Torah interests. So Jewish law is incredibly flexible, and it's often wielded by Orthodox rabbis and those who have power and influence in what they see as service to the Jewish people.
But eventually the interrogators drew enough out of him to identify at least two of them. Kahlo, the head of the division that oversaw the Jewish department, went to the Attorney General to argue that the rabbis should be detained immediately and prosecuted for incitement to murder. But the Attorney General disagreed, saying the rabbis' encouragement was protected speech and couldn't be directly linked to the murder. No rabbis were arrested. Days later, however, the police brought Raviv, the Shin Bet operative known as Champagne, into custody in a Tel Aviv magistrate court on charges that he had conspired to kill Rabin, but he was released shortly after. Raviv's role as an informant later came to light. And in 1990...
So we have in the chat, hypocrites pretend to believe in God. Well, we don't have any objective test whether people believe in God. What you're invoking is the no true Scotsman fallacy. Oh, no true Scotsman would believe this way. We just have no empirical evidence that people who believe in God or don't believe in God in and of that category are more or less likely to do heinous things. We do have evidence that religious people are more likely to treat members of their in-group in a positive fashion, right? Religious people are more likely to have a strong in-group identity. Also, religious people tend to be more connected to their families than secular people. So if you value your family, if you value having children, if you value a monogamous relationship with your wife and raising children within that monogamous relationship, your path will be a lot easier if you practice religion. So on the other hand, right, secular people who have families and children who have good relations with others, right, they generally don't go off the deep end and commit heinous acts, right? Usually serial killers, for example, come from highly disconnected, lonely lives. And I would have more trust in the morality of the behavior of secular atheist people who are strongly connected to others, such as their family, than in the behavior of religious people who believe in God, but they aren't able to sustain relationships.
In 1999, he was arrested for his failure to act on previous knowledge of the assassination. He was acquitted on all charges, but he has since become a fixture of extremist conspiracy theories that pose his failure to ring the alarm as evidence that the murder of the prime minister was due not to the violent rhetoric of the settler right, or the death sentences from the rabbis, or...
So in news media and a lot of conventional discourse, it's kind of taken for granted that if someone's acquitted of charges, that means they're innocent. And if someone's found guilty, that means they did it. but this is a bureaucratic process that is highly imperfect. I mean, O.J. Simpson got away with murder in his criminal trial, right? Often people who commit murder get away with it, and sometimes innocent people get convicted. So just because you have a bureaucratic process, that doesn't mean that that bureaucratic process equals 100% truth. Right? In democratic cities, all right, you have district attorneys and police forces that are run in part according to the interests of voters for the Democratic Party and against the interests of people who would vote Republican.
The incitement by the leaders of the opposition, but to the all too successful efforts of a Shin Bet agent provocateur. A more complicated and insidious conspiracy theory, but no less false, was that it was Shin Bet itself that assassinated Rabin or allowed the assassination to happen. Guillon, the head of the service at the time, resigned, and ongoing inquiries, charges, and countercharges would continue for years. Until October 7, 2023, the killing of the Prime Minister was considered the greatest failure in the history of Shin Bet. Kahlo tried to sum up what went wrong with Israeli security. The only answer my friends and I could give for the failure was complacency. He wrote in his 2021 memoir, "They simply couldn't believe that such a thing could happen. Definitely not at the hands of another Jew." 11. The Sasson Report. In 2001, as the Second Intifada unleashed a wave of Palestinian suicide bombings against Israeli civilians, Ariel Sharon took office as prime minister. The struggling peace process had come to a complete halt amid the violence, and Sharon's rise at first appeared to mark another victory for the settlers. But in 2003, in one of the more surprising reversals in Israeli political history, Sharon announced what he called Israel's disengagement from Gaza, with a plan to remove settlers, forcibly if necessary, over the next 2 years. The motivations were complex and the subject of considerable debate. For Sharon, at least, it appeared to be a tactical move. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. His senior advisor, Dov Weissglass, told Haaretz at the time. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. But Sharon was also facing considerable pressure from President George W. Bush to do something about the ever-expanding illegal settlements in the West Bank, which were a growing impediment to any regional security deals. In July 2004, he asked Talia Sasson, who had recently retired as the head of the Special Tasks Division in the State Attorney's Office, to draw up a legal opinion on the subject of unauthorized outposts in the West Bank.
So when you disengage from the enemy and you retreat behind borders, right, that's one useful tactic. You can't have a civilization without borders, right? Unless you're able to protect yourself from interlopers, from non-citizens, from people who are trying to take advantage of the prosperity that you're creating, right? You're not going to be able to maintain a civilization. Like, all decency or civilization depends upon the ability to keep out, those who don't belong, who are not part of your in-group.
His instructions were clear. Investigate which Israeli government agencies and authorities were secretly involved in building the outposts. Sharon never interfered in my work, and neither was he surprised by the conclusions. Sasson said in an interview 2 decades later.
All right, let's check out a little bit here from Destiny going up against JF.
Offense, you piece of shit, you idiot, moral fag, internet moral fagging, you idiot, you idiot, moral fags, you idiot, and I don't give a flying shit.
In JF's own words, a 19-year-old girl communicated with him online. He fell in love with her, he convinced her to leave her family and join him, and then after 3 weeks of being with her, a girl that had never lived on her own, worked a job, lived apart from her parents, been in a relationship, he convinced her to try to have a child with him.
First, I will say you cannot believe anything that you read in there. It's been written by lawyers. So what you see there are allegations. We were in love, and the court decided that they would make her unable to consent. That's the court's choice. I disagree with it, and she disagreed with the court too, because she wanted to be with me.
If she disagreed, then...
But don't claim that the arguments of the lawyer of the other side, those who were trying to support the position of her father, which was that she was unable to consent, don't take these allegations as truth. They have not been found truthful by the judge.
Oh, let me in here, please!
Yeah, and I'm not going to bring that up, Destiny, at the moment, because I have no evidence or anything.
I have no evidence
He's
for anything!
They're all in caps lock.
Yeah, I mean,
it's all
the
in the
answer
court
to
docs.
Destiny is, yeah, you can dig in my past. You know what you will find.
I'm not
You will
digging.
find that there's
It's all
7
listed in
women
the
total
court
in my
docs.
life that have accused me of crimes that I've not committed, and that I was found non-guilty in every single fucking case. Well,
When he says
try
found
to
not
get
guilty,
me-
did the state of Texas even pursue charges against him that he had molested the girl, or that he'd taken advantage of her, or that it was statutory rape? That's not being found not guilty. That means they didn't go after charges. Oh, yes.
Would you want to talk to him about this shit, or you just want to?
Yeah, bring me on.
Like say fuck him.
Bring me on.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's not gonna be a very pleasant show because he's gonna come and he's gonna drop all sorts of falsity, and I'm gonna be responding the same thing all over again, which is, yeah, those were allegations.
Bring 'em in.
They were not found to
Bring
be
'em
proved
in.
by a court.
Bring 'em
If
in.
you think there
Bring 'em in.
is an
Bring 'em in.
entertainment
Bring me
value
in.
to this, bring him on. I don't mind, but I'm telling you, it's gonna be a very sad discussion. I don't care about your moral offense, you piece of shit.
Sure, you don't have to care about my moral offense because the court already agreed with me about the moral offense. She had never lived on her own before, and despite all of this, you convinced her to leave her family without a word to join you and make a baby.
That's called love, you idiot.
That's called love? But a 19-year-old girl? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, a 19-year-old girl can love, you idiot. Do you want people in the future to be scared of going out with mentally disabled people? Eventually, destiny will find out and it will ruin their life. Now, it is a 19-year-old woman who was free to make her choices. Steven can come here and express moral offense. Who cares? Everyone on the chat says 19 is legal, Steven.
So why didn't she fight the court about being appointed a guardian, JF? If she wanted to be...
She was intimidated, physically abused by her father, and intimidated into abandoning her rights.
You're saying that a girl was so easily intimidated that she quickly gave up her right to exist as an autonomous person, but you claim the same person was mature enough to make the decision to move in with you and bear your child?
The reality is that anyone going out with any autistic person of any age could eventually be judged by destiny as being wrong, even if that person is found to be non-able to consent after the actions have occurred and after the relationship has occurred.
I'm not sure what other destiny...
Okay, Destiny is very good. He's very smart. He's very good at debate. JF is also very smart and very good at debate. All right, back to the big picture, the in-depth New York Times article on Israeli West Bank settlers.
After all, he knew better than anyone what the situation was on the ground, and he was expecting only grave conclusions. It was a simple enough question. Just how had it happened that hundreds of outposts had been built in the decades since Yitzhak Rabin ordered a halt in most new settlements? But Sasson's effort to find an answer was met with delays, avoidance, and outright lies. Her final report used careful but pointed language. Not everyone I turned to agreed to talk with me. One claimed he was too busy to meet, while another came to the meeting but refused to meaningfully engage with most of my questions. Sasson found that between January 2000 and June 2003, a division of Israel's Construction and Housing Ministry issued 77 contracts for the establishment of 33 sites in the West Bank, all of which were illegal.
Okay, that'll do it for today. Talk to you blokes later. Quranic secularism says the culture war is between atheists and people subscribing to traditional values. making them more likely to have legitimate children staying together for the sake of the children, producing then children who are more capable of doing the same thing.